Hello there, and welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Adjust your pillow, let your body settle into whatever position feels right. There's no rush. We have all the time in the world. Where in the world are you watching from? A quiet bedroom as the night deepens? A cozy corner where the weight of the day is finally lifting? Wherever you are, you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight we're going to explore one of history's most fascinating transformations, the Knights Templar, warrior monks who began as 9 poor knights, protecting pilgrims, and became the international bankers of medieval Europe. We'll discover how holy warriors became financial innovators, how vows of poverty coexisted with immense organizational wealth, and how success itself planted the seeds of their destruction. We'll meet the men who founded the order, walk the dangerous roads they protected, explore the vaults where they revolutionized banking, and slowly, carefully, piece together how they changed the medieval world forever. But don't worry. This isn't going to be a frantic recounting of battles and conspiracies, or a sensational exploration of hidden treasures. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through 2 centuries, from 1119 to 1312, from Jerusalem to Paris, from swords to ledgers. We'll take our time with the innovations, the contradictions, the quiet revolutionaries in white cloaks marked with red crosses. By the end, I think you'll find that the Templars' story is not just about monks and money, but about how institutions rise and fall, how innovation happens in unexpected places, and how the same forces that create power can ultimately destroy it. If you enjoy these calm explorations of history's most profound transformations, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to end their day. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being part of this community of thoughtful listeners. So settle in, let your shoulders drop away from your ears, take a slow breath, in through your nose, out through your mouth, and let's begin our slow drift through the medieval world, through crusades and credit networks, through prayer and profit, toward understanding. There's nowhere you need to be. No deadlines to meet. Just listen, and let the story unfold like a long, quiet conversation between old friends. Let it wash over you. If you drift away, that's perfectly fine. That's what we're here for. Let's begin in 1095, when a pope stood before a crowd in France and changed the world. The late 11th century was a world we would barely recognize. Europe was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, counties, and principalities, each jealously guarding its own territory, each ruled by nobles whose power came from controlling land and the people who worked it. There was no unified nation of France or Germany or Italy, just fractured territories where a count might owe allegiance to a duke, who owed allegiance to a king, who theoretically owed allegiance to an emperor, but where actual power depended on who could command the most armed men. It was a violent world. Knights, armoured warriors on horseback, were the dominant military force, and they spent much of their time fighting each other over land disputes, inheritance claims, or simply because fighting was what they did. The Church tried to channel this violence, creating concepts like the peace of God and the truce of God, attempting to limit when and where fighting could happen. But violence was woven into the fabric of feudal society. Into this world stepped Pope Urban II. In November of 1095, he travelled to Clermont in central France and addressed a crowd that had gathered in a field outside the city. We don't know his exact words. The accounts were written down later and differ in details, but we know the essence of what he said, and we know it changed history. Urban spoke of Jerusalem, the holy city, the place where Christ had walked and died and risen. He spoke of Christian pilgrims travelling to Jerusalem, seeking to walk where Jesus had walked, to pray at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre built over the site of the crucifixion. And he spoke of how these pilgrims were being harassed, attacked, sometimes killed by Muslims who controlled the region. This wasn't entirely true, or at least it was more complicated than Urban made it sound. Muslim rulers had controlled Jerusalem for centuries, and Christian pilgrims had generally been allowed to visit, but Urban was painting a picture, creating a narrative that would move his audience. He called on the knights of Europe to stop fighting each other and instead march to Jerusalem, to liberate the Holy Land, to protect pilgrims, to reclaim the city for Christianity. And he offered something extraordinary: complete forgiveness of sins for anyone who took up the cross and went on crusade. This was called a plenary indulgence, and in the medieval mindset it was invaluable. People in the 11th century believed deeply, viscerally in heaven and hell, in judgment after death, in the very real possibility of eternal damnation. The promise that your sins would be forgiven, that you would bypass years or centuries in purgatory, that you would go straight to heaven if you died on crusade. This was an offer that spoke to the deepest fears and hopes of medieval Christians. The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming. Men began shouting, quote, "Zero! God wills it!" They tore cloth into crosses and sewed them onto their clothes. Within days, within weeks, the call to crusade spread across Europe like wildfire. Nobles began organising expeditions. Knights started selling or mortgaging their lands to raise money for the journey. Common people, peasants and townspeople who had no military training, also took up the cross, believing that God would protect them and provide for them. And let's think for a moment about what it meant to go on crusade. This wasn't a simple journey. Jerusalem was roughly 2,000 miles from Paris, and there were no maps as we understand them, no reliable roads across much of the distance, no organised supply lines. You would be travelling through territories controlled by different rulers, some Christian, some Muslim, some neither friendly nor hostile but simply indifferent to your passage. If you were a knight, you needed armour, chainmail that weighed 40 or 50 pounds, a helmet, a shield, a sword, perhaps a lance. You needed a horse, and not just any horse, but a war horse, a destrier, specially trained and enormously expensive. Actually, you needed several horses, because horses died or went lame or were stolen. You needed a squire to help you with your armour and weapons. You needed pack animals to carry supplies. You needed food for the journey. And gold or silver to buy more food along the way. The cost was staggering. Historians estimate that going on crusade could cost a knight the equivalent of 4 or 5 years' income from his lands. Many knights mortgaged or sold their estates to raise the necessary funds. They were quite literally betting everything on this journey, gambling that they would return victorious and wealthy from plunder, or that they would die and go to heaven, or that somehow God would provide. And then there was the journey itself. Imagine leaving your home in, say, northern France in the spring of 1096. You ride south and east, through territories that are mostly friendly, but where you still have to pay tolls, buy provisions at inflated prices, guard against bandits. You cross the Alps into Italy, then continue east to the Adriatic coast. From there, you might take ship to Constantinople, if you can find a ship and afford passage. Or you might march overland through the Balkans, through territories where the local rulers are Christian but speak different languages and regard you with suspicion. If you reach Constantinople, you encounter the Byzantine Empire, Christian but following different liturgical traditions, speaking Greek rather than Latin, sophisticated and wealthy, and deeply ambivalent about this horde of Western warriors arriving at their gates. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I had asked for military help, but he had wanted a few thousand professional soldiers, not tens of thousands of armed pilgrims. Nevertheless, you push on. You cross into Anatolia, into territory controlled by Seljuk Turks. The climate is harsh, burning hot in summer, bitter cold in winter. Water is scarce, the local population is hostile, and everywhere, at every stage, there is death. People died from disease, dysentery, typhoid, fevers we can't even identify now. They died from hunger when supplies ran out. They died from thirst crossing the Anatolian plateau. They died from infected wounds, from accidents, from exposure. They died in ambushes and skirmishes with local forces. The First Crusade probably began with somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 people. by the time the Crusaders reached Jerusalem in June of 1099, their numbers had been cut roughly in half. But they did reach Jerusalem. After a brutal siege that lasted over a month, they breached the walls on July 15th, 1099. What followed was a massacre. The Crusaders, driven by religious fervour, by months of hardship and fear, by the siege logic that a city taken by storm could be plundered, killed most of the Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. The streets, according to contemporary accounts, ran with blood. The Crusaders then went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and wept and prayed, giving thanks for their victory. I share this not to be sensational or to condemn, but to help you understand the mindset and the world we're exploring. To the Crusaders, this was a holy act. They believed they were reclaiming sacred ground, avenging centuries of Muslim control, fulfilling God's will. The fact that we might view their actions differently now doesn't change how they understood themselves. And it doesn't change the practical result. Christian forces now controlled Jerusalem and a strip of territory along the eastern Mediterranean coast. They called these territories Outre-mer, which means quote one in French. They established kingdoms and principalities. The kingdom of Jerusalem, the county of Tripoli, the principality of Antioch, the county of Edessa. European nobles became the rulers of these territories. They built castles, established courts, created a feudal system transported from Europe and imposed on the Levant. But controlling territory and making it safe were different things. The Crusader states were thin strips along the coast and in some inland areas, surrounded by Muslim territories that were initially disorganized but would eventually unite against the invaders. The Crusader population was never large, maybe 20,000 European settlers at most, supported by local Christians and a much larger Muslim and Jewish population that the Crusaders ruled but never fully trusted. And now, with Jerusalem under Christian control, pilgrims began arriving from Europe in much great numbers. This had been one of Urban's stated goals, to make pilgrimage safe and possible. Ships brought pilgrims to the ports of Outre-mer. From there, they travelled inland to Jerusalem, to Bethlehem, to Nazareth, to all the holy sites associated with the life of Christ. But these pilgrims were vulnerable. They were civilians, often elderly, sometimes women and children. They travelled in groups but rarely with significant military protection. And the roads of Outre-mer, despite Christian control of the major cities, were dangerous. Bandits operated in the hills and mountains. Muslim raiders from surrounding territories conducted hit-and-run attacks. Even local Christians sometimes preyed on wealthy pilgrims. Consider a pilgrim arriving at the port of Jaffa in, say, 1110. You've survived the sea journey from Italy or France, itself a dangerous undertaking. You've brought with you money for the journey, probably gold or silver coins, sewn into your clothes or carried in a purse. You need this money to pay for food, lodging, guides, donations at holy sites. You might also be carrying valuables, jewellery perhaps, that you plan to offer at a shrine. From Jaffa, Jerusalem is only about 35 miles inland, but it's 35 miles through rocky, hilly terrain with limited water and plenty of places for ambush. You might travel with other pilgrims for safety, but you're still a tempting target. If you're robbed, you lose not just your money but potentially your ability to complete your pilgrimage. If you're killed, well, you were seeking salvation through pilgrimage, and instead you've died before reaching your goal. Your family back in Europe might never know what happened to you. This was the situation in the early 12th century. Jerusalem was in Christian hands, pilgrimage was theoretically possible, but the actual experience of pilgrimage remained dangerous, expensive, and often deadly. The Crusader states needed defending, the roads needed patrolling, pilgrims needed protection, and into this need, into this gap between the ideal of a liberated Holy Land and the reality of continued danger, would step 9 knights with a radical idea. But we'll come to them soon. For now, picture the landscape. Harsh, beautiful, holy ground that had been fought over for millennia and would continue to be fought over for centuries to come. Dust and heat and the smell of horses, the weight of armour under the Levantine sun, the constant alertness for danger, stone cities with walls built and rebuilt, castles perched on hills, roads winding through valleys where an attack could come from anywhere. This was the world that created the need for the Knights Templar. This was the world they would try to make safe. Let that image settle as we prepare to meet the 9 men who would change everything. In 1119, 20 years after the fall of Jerusalem, a French knight named Hugues de Payan stood before King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with a proposal that must have seemed very strange indeed. Hugues was not young. He was probably in his 40s, which in the 12th century meant he was approaching what many considered old age. He'd come to Outremer years earlier, perhaps on crusade, and had stayed. He had seen the dangers pilgrims faced. He had watched travellers arrive at the port cities full of hope and devotion, only to be robbed or killed on the roads to Jerusalem, and he had decided to do something about it. Hugues came before the king with 8 companions. We know some of their names: Godfrey de Saint-Omer, Payen de Montdidier, Archambault de Saint-Agnan, André de Montbard. Others are lost to history. 9 men total, none of them particularly wealthy or powerful, all of them experienced warriors who had proven themselves in the violent world of the Crusader states. Their proposal was this: they would form a new kind of brotherhood. They would take the 3 traditional monastic vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. They would live as monks, following a religious rule, praying at set hours throughout the day and night. But they would also remain warriors. They would keep their weapons and their horses and their military training, and their specific mission, their reason for existence, would be to protect pilgrims travelling to and from Jerusalem. Think about how revolutionary this was. Monks were supposed to withdraw from the world, to live in monasteries, to pray and work and contemplate God. They were supposed to renounce violence, to turn the other cheek, to embrace humility and peace. Warriors, on the other hand, were men of violence. Their purpose was to fight, to kill when necessary, to defend their lords and their lands through force of arms. The 2 roles seemed fundamentally incompatible, but Hugues and his companions were proposing to be both. They would be monks who fought, warriors who prayed. They would embrace poverty individually while maintaining the expensive equipment needed for warfare. They would take vows of chastity in a culture where knights were expected to marry and produce heirs. They would vow obedience not to a secular lord but to God and to their own elected leader. King Baldwin listened to this proposal and remarkably agreed. Perhaps he recognised the genuine need for such a force. Perhaps he saw political advantage in having a group of warriors who owed allegiance to no noble family and couldn't be pulled into the endless feudal disputes that weakened the Crusader states. Perhaps he was simply moved by the evident sincerity of these 9 men. Whatever his reasoning, he granted them something extraordinary: quarters in the royal palace complex on the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount was, and is, one of the most sacred sites in Jerusalem. It was the location where Solomon's temple had stood, the first temple of the ancient Israelites, destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 before Christ. The second temple, rebuilt and greatly expanded by King Herod, had stood on this same site until it was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. By the time the Crusaders captured Jerusalem, the site was occupied by 2 magnificent Muslim structures, the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Crusaders, in their characteristic blend of ignorance and appropriation, believed that the Al-Aqsa Mosque had been Solomon's temple, or at least built on its exact foundations. They were wrong, but their belief gave the site tremendous significance. King Baldwin gave Hugues and his companions a section of the palace complex adjacent to the mosque. Because of this location, the new brotherhood became known as the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. A cumbersome name. They soon became known simply as the Knights of the Temple, or the Templars. Now let's be clear about their poverty in these early years. This wasn't the pretend poverty of an organisation that claims to be poor while holding vast resources. For at least the first decade, these 9 men were genuinely poor. They relied on donations from pilgrims and crusader nobles. They shared everything in common. Later seal of the Templars would show 2 knights riding a single horse, symbolising both their poverty and their brotherhood. Whether this image reflected actual practice or was symbolic is debated, but it captured how they saw themselves. Their daily life combined the routines of both monk and warrior. They rose for matins, the first prayer service, in the deep hours of the night when darkness was total and the city slept. They prayed again at Lauds at dawn, then at prime, terce, sext, none, vespers and compline, the traditional 8 prayer hours that structured monastic life. Between these prayers, they trained. They practiced swordsmanship, horsemanship, formation fighting. They maintained their equipment, which was crucial because armour and weapons in constant use required constant care. They ate simple meals, bread, vegetables, a little fish, wine watered down. Meat was rare, a luxury for feast days. They slept in a shared dormitory, beds arranged in rows, no privacy, no personal possessions beyond the bare minimum. Their clothing was simple, white robes for full knights, brown or black for sergeants and support staff. Though in these early years such distinctions may not have existed. They owned nothing individually, everything belonged to the Brotherhood, and they rode patrol. This was their core mission. They would escort pilgrim groups from the coast to Jerusalem, armed and alert, watching the ridgelines and valleys for signs of ambush. They would investigate reports of bandit activity. They would, when necessary, fight, and some of them died in this service, killed in skirmishes with raiders, sometimes dying from wounds that became infected because 12th century medicine could do little for a deep sword cut. For the first several years they remained obscure, 9 knights, 10, 12. Their numbers grew slowly. They had no official recognition from the church beyond the local support of the Patriarch of Jerusalem. They had no written rule, just the understanding among themselves of how they would live. They had a mission, but no certainty that their experiment would survive. What changed everything was the support of one of medieval Europe's most influential figures, Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was a Cistercian monk, abbot of the monastery of Clairvaux in France. The Cistercians were themselves a reform movement, seeking to return to a stricter, more austere form of monasticism than they felt the established Benedictine order practiced. Bernard was brilliant, eloquent, politically connected, and absolutely convinced of his own rightness on matters of faith and practice. He was, in modern terms, an influencer, someone whose opinions carried weight across Europe. Hugues de Payen travelled to Europe around 1127, seeking recruits, donations, and official recognition. He visited Bernard at Clairvaux. Perhaps André de Montbard, one of the original 9 knights, helped arrange this meeting. He was Bernard's uncle, and family connections mattered in the 12th century. Bernard listened to Hugues describe the Templar mission and became convinced this was exactly what Christendom needed. Bernard wrote a treatise called Quote II. In it, he contrasted the Templars with secular knights, and the contrast was not favourable to the latter. Secular knights, Bernard wrote, fought for vain glory, for wealth, for territorial disputes that meant nothing in the eyes of God. They wore elaborate clothing, grew their hair long, covered themselves in ornaments. They were, in Bernard's view, essentially engaged in sin even when they fought. The Templars, by contrast, fought for Christ. They fought to protect pilgrims, to defend holy sites, to battle the enemies of God. Their violence was sanctified by their purpose. They were, Bernard argued, a new kind of knight, the novum militia genus, the new knighthood. When a Templar killed in battle, it was not murder, but malicide, the killing of evil. When a Templar died in battle, it was martyrdom that led straight to heaven. This theological justification was crucial. The Church had always been uncomfortable with the idea of Christian violence. The commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," was clear. But Bernard provided a framework that made Templar violence not just acceptable but holy. He took the tension at the heart of the Templar identity, warrior and monk, and resolved it by arguing that properly directed violence in service of God was itself a form of prayer. Bernard's treatise circulated widely. His prestige gave the Templars credibility they couldn't have earned on their own. Suddenly being a Templar wasn't just acceptable, it was admirable. Young men from noble families across Europe began to take an interest. Donations began to arrive. In January of 1129, a church council convened at Troyes in France. Pope Honorius II sent representatives. Bernard attended. French bishops and nobles gathered, and the council granted the Templars official recognition. They were now formally acknowledged as a religious order. Just as importantly, the council approved a rule, a written set of regulations governing how Templars would live. This rule, largely written by Bernard or under his direction, codified what had previously been informal practice. It specified the prayers Templars must recite, the clothing they could wear, the food they could eat, the discipline for various infractions. Let me share some of its details, because they reveal how the Templars understood themselves. The rule specified that Templars must attend all 8 daily prayer services when possible. When in the field, when prayers in chapel were impossible, they must recite the Paternoster, the Our Father, a specified number of times to substitute for each service. This ensured that even in the midst of military campaigns, the rhythm of prayer continued. Templars were to wear simple clothing. The rule specified white robes for knights, white symbolizing purity, and darker robes for sergeants and others. Later, the Red Cross would be added to their clothing, the distinctive symbol that we associate with Templars today. But this came later, granted by Pope Eugenius III in 1147. In 1129 they wore plain white. They were forbidden from wearing pointed shoes, which were fashionable among nobles. They couldn't grow their hair long or maintain elaborate beards. No jewellery, no ornate sword hilts, no decorated horse trappings. Everything was to be functional, simple, focused on utility rather than display. This was meant to contrast with secular knights, who often dressed in the most elaborate and expensive way they could afford. The rule governed eating. Templars ate in silence or listening to religious readings. Meat was allowed 3 times per week, more than most monks received, recognition of the physical demands of military service. They were forbidden from hunting for sport, which was a favourite pastime of nobles. The only acceptable hunting was killing lions, because lions were dangerous. This may seem oddly specific, but it reveals that Templars in Outremer did occasionally encounter lions, which still lived in the region. Sleeping arrangements were specified. Templars slept in a common dormitory, beds visible to each other, a light burning through the night. They slept in their shirts and breeches, belted, ready to rise quickly if needed. This was both practical, military necessity, and spiritual, discouraging any private vice that might occur in darkness and privacy. The rule addressed warfare. Templars were forbidden from asking for mercy or paying ransom if captured by Muslims. They must fight to the death or accept martyrdom. They could not retreat unless outnumbered more than 3 to 1. They were to charge when the Templar banner advanced and hold position when it stopped. Discipline in battle was paramount. Punishments for infractions were detailed. Lesser offences might be punished by having to eat on the floor rather than at table, or by performing extra labour. Serious offences, striking another Templar, desertion, theft, simony, betraying secrets to outsiders, could result in expulsion from the order. This was considered a fate worse than death, because it meant losing your salvation along with your brotherhood. And the rule established hierarchy. At the top was the Grand Master, elected by the chapter for life. Below him were various officers, the seneschal, the marshal who commanded in battle, the commander of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, commanders of other territories, and so on down through ranks of knights, sergeants, and support staff. This hierarchy ensured order and clear lines of authority, essential for both a military force and a religious order. What emerges from the rule is a portrait of extraordinary discipline and focus. These were men who gave up everything: wealth, family, comfort, personal freedom, for a mission they believed was holy. They accepted a life that was harder than that of regular monks, who at least had the peace of the cloister, and harder than that of secular knights, who could marry, own property, and enjoy the pleasures of noble life. And yet, men joined. After the Council of Troy, after Bernard's endorsement, recruitment increased. By the 1130s, the Templars had expanded from the original 9 to several dozen, then to over 100. Nobles donated land to support them, estates in France, England, Spain, Italy. These donations were motivated partly by genuine piety, partly by hope that the Templars' prayers would benefit the donor's soul, and partly by the medieval practice of giving to religious institutions as a form of insurance against damnation. The Templars were no longer just 9 poor knights in Jerusalem. They were becoming an organisation, one with a clear mission, official recognition, growing resources, and an expanding network of properties across Christian Europe. They were still primarily warriors, still focused on protecting pilgrims and fighting in defence of the Crusade estates. The banking would come later. For now, they were exactly what they claimed to be: the poor fellow soldiers of Christ, monks who had taken up the sword in service of God. But the foundation had been laid. The organisational structure existed. The network was forming. The reputation for discipline, courage, and piety was growing. In 1119, Hugues de Payan had brought a strange idea to King Baldwin. By 1130, barely a decade later, that idea had become an institution that would shape the medieval world in ways no one yet imagined. The Templars had been born, small and poor and uncertain, but carrying within themselves the seeds of something vast. Let that image rest: 9 men in white robes, kneeling in prayer at dawn on the Temple Mount, then rising to don armour and ride out into danger. Convinced they were doing God's work. That conviction, that fusion of faith and warfare would drive everything that followed. Bernard of Clairvaux's support changed everything for the Templars, but not immediately, and not in ways that were obvious at first. The transformation from 9 poor knights to an international organisation took decades and happened through thousands of individual decisions: a young man choosing to join, a widow deciding to donate land, a bishop offering his blessing, a merchant providing funds. Let's explore how this machinery of growth worked. How the Templars expanded from a handful of warriors in Jerusalem to a network spanning all of Christian Europe. Bernard's treatise, quote 6, was more than just theological justification. It was, in effect, a recruitment pamphlet, and it circulated widely in the 1130s and 1140s. Remember that books in this era were hand-copied manuscripts, expensive and rare. But Bernard's work was important enough that monasteries and cathedrals made copies. It was read aloud in churches. Travelling preachers cited it. The idea spread through the networks of clerics and nobles who formed medieval Europe's educated class, and the message resonated. Bernard painted a picture of secular knighthood that was damning. He described knights who fought for empty glory, who wore elaborate clothes and grew their hair long like women, who risked their souls for territorial disputes that meant nothing in eternity. Then he contrasted this with the Templars, warriors who had renounced vanity, who fought for Christ, who had achieved salvation through their service. The appeal was powerful, especially for men who were genuinely pious, but also genuinely violent, men who wanted to believe their skill with weapons could serve God. Consider the situation of a second son in a noble family. In medieval Europe, inheritance typically followed primogeniture. The eldest son inherited everything. This made practical sense in a world where dividing estates among multiple heirs would fragment them into pieces too small to support a noble lifestyle. But it meant that younger sons had to find their own path. Some became clerics, rising through church hierarchy. Some became administrators or advisors. Some married wealthy heiresses if they could find them, and some became landless knights, either serving in their eldest brother's household or wandering from court to court, offering their military services for pay. For a second son who was pious, the Templars offered something remarkable. You could keep your identity as a warrior. You didn't have to give up your training, your skill, your sense of yourself as a fighting man. But you could also serve God directly, guarantee your salvation, and join a brotherhood that promised meaning and purpose. You would be poor individually, yes, but the order would provide for your needs. You would never marry, but you would have brothers closer than any family. You would face danger. But you would face it in the most sacred cause imaginable. The Templars recruited actively. Hugues de Payens travelled through France in 1128 and 1129, visiting courts, speaking at churches, seeking both members and donations. He went to England and met with King Henry I. He went to Scotland. Everywhere he went, he told the story of the order, explained its mission, and asked for support. Other Templar leaders did the same in Spain, Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire. The recruits came, young men, mostly from noble families but also from the emerging class of wealthy merchants and free farmers. They went through a probationary period, testing their commitment. Then, if accepted, they participated in a reception ceremony. They knelt before the master or commander of their preceptory. They promised to obey God and the Virgin Mary and the master of the temple. They promised to live in chastity and without property. They promised to help conquer the Holy Land. They were given the white mantle if they were of noble birth and proven as knights, or the brown or black mantle if they were sergeants, and they became part of a brotherhood that would define the rest of their lives. Donations flowed alongside recruits. Medieval Christianity had a strong tradition of charitable giving, especially to religious institutions. People believed, genuinely believed, that donations to the church or to religious orders would benefit their souls, reducing time in purgatory, earning prayers from the monks or canons they supported. The Templars, as a new and highly visible order dedicated to a sacred military mission, attracted enormous donations. Sometimes these were monetary, gold or silver coins given to support the order's work, but more often, in an economy where most wealth was in land rather than money, donations were in the form of estates. A noble might donate a manor with its fields, forests, peasants, mills, and rents. A widow might donate the property she had inherited from her husband. A merchant might donate land he had purchased as investment. Each donation, individually, might seem modest. A few acres here, a small manor there. But they accumulated. By the 1140s, the Templars held lands across France, particularly in Champagne, Burgundy, and the south. They had properties in England granted by nobles and confirmed by the king. They had estates in Spain, where Christian kingdoms were slowly pushing back Muslim rule in the Reconquista. They had holdings in Italy, in the Holy Roman Empire, in the Kingdom of Jerusalem itself, and these lands generated income. Medieval estates operated on a feudal system. Peasants worked the land, paying rent in the form of crops or labour or money. Mills charged fees for grinding grain. Forests provided timber and game. Vineyards produced wine. All of this revenue flowed to the landowner, in this case to the Templars. The order took these revenues and used them to support their mission, buying armour and horses, maintaining castles, supplying their forces in Outremer, supporting new recruits. To manage this growing network of properties, the Templars established preceptories. A preceptory was a regional headquarters, usually built around a donated castle or large manor house. It served as an administrative centre for Templar lands in the area, training ground for recruits, storehouse for supplies, and sometimes as a chapel for local worship. Each preceptory was commanded by a preceptor or commander, who reported up the organisational hierarchy. Let's think about how this organisational structure worked, because it was remarkably sophisticated for its time. At the top was the Grand Master, residing usually in Jerusalem or later in Acre, the main Crusader port city. The Grand Master was elected by the chapter, a gathering of senior Templar officers, and served for life unless removed for serious cause. Below the Grand Master were several high officers who formed a kind of executive council. The Seneschal was second in command, able to act in the Grand Master's absence. The Marshal commanded the Order's military forces, responsible for discipline, training and battlefield tactics. The commander of the Kingdom of Jerusalem oversaw the Order's operations in Outremer, a position of enormous responsibility. The draper managed clothing and equipment. The treasurer, as you might expect, managed finances. Each of these positions was filled by election or appointment from among experienced Templars. Below this central leadership were regional commanders overseeing Templar operations in different territories, the commander of France, the commander of England, the commander of Spain, and so on. These regional commanders supervised multiple preceptories in their territories, ensuring that local commanders followed the rule, collecting revenues, forwarding funds to support the operations in Outremer, and recruiting new members. At the local level, each preceptory had its own commander and staff. There were knights, full members who had taken all vows and could wear the white mantle. There were sergeants, warriors of non-noble birth or those still in training wearing brown or black. There were chaplains, ordained priests who celebrated Mass and heard confessions, and there was support staff, craftsmen, stable hands, cooks, scribes. This hierarchy enabled coordination across enormous distances. A donation made to a preceptory in England could be converted to funds that supported Templar operations in Jerusalem. A young man joining in France could be trained there and then sent to reinforce Templar forces in Spain or Outremer. Information flowed up and down the chain of command. The rule was enforced consistently. The organisation functioned as a unified body despite being spread across thousands of miles, and the organisation grew wealthy. Not the individual Templars, they still owned nothing personally, still slept in dormitories, still ate simple food. But the Order as an institution accumulated resources. By the mid-12th century, the Templars owned hundreds of estates across Europe. They had castles, both in Outremer and in Europe. They had flocks of sheep and herds of cattle. They had vineyards and grain fields. They had mills and forges. They had ships to transport supplies and pilgrims. This created a paradox that some observers found troubling even then. Individual Templars had taken vows of poverty and lived simply. But the order they belonged to was becoming one of the wealthiest institutions in Christendom. Was this consistent with their founding mission as poor fellow soldiers? The Templars argued yes. They needed resources to fulfill their mission of protecting pilgrims and defending the Holy Land. Individual poverty kept them from corruption, while organisational wealth enabled them to serve effectively. But the tension was real and would grow over time. Their military mission expanded beyond protecting pilgrims. As the Crusader states came under increasing pressure from Muslim forces, the Templars became a core component of the Crusader military. They provided a permanent professional force in a world where most armies were temporary gatherings of feudal levies. They maintained discipline and training. They could be relied upon to hold a defensive position or to lead a charge. Their reputation for courage, some might say recklessness, grew. They participated in most major military operations in Outremer. When King Louis VII of France led the Second Crusade in 1147 through 1149, Templars formed part of the Crusader army. The crusade was largely a failure, achieving little, but the Templars acquitted themselves well in the fighting. They began to hold and garrison major castles in the Crusader states, taking on responsibility for defending strategic locations. Castle Pilgrim, Tortosa, Athlet. These fortresses controlled key routes and coastlines, and the Templars maintained them at great expense. In battle, they followed strict discipline, They charged only when ordered. They held their positions even when outnumbered. They did not pursue fleeing enemies beyond a certain distance, avoiding the trap of breaking formation in the heat of victory. This discipline made them effective but also led to heavy casualties. They would not retreat, would not surrender, would not ask for ransom if captured. They died in large numbers, fighting to the end as their rule required. Stories of Templar courage spread. At the Battle of Montgisard in 1177, a Crusader force of about 500 knights faced Saladin's army of perhaps 26,000. The Crusaders, including a contingent of Templars, charged in desperate hope and achieved a stunning victory, scattering Saladin's forces. Whether this was brilliant tactics, divine intervention, or simply the chaos of medieval warfare is debated, but it burnished the Templar reputation. In Spain, Templars fought in the Reconquista, helping Christian kingdoms push southward against Muslim taifas. They were granted lands and castles in Aragon and Catalonia. They established preceptories in Portugal. Their mission in Spain mirrored their mission in Outremer, fighting to expand or defend Christian territory against Muslim rule, protecting pilgrims travelling to Santiago de Compostela. They became, by the mid to late 12th century, an international institution of formidable power. They had members across Europe and in the Holy Land. They had enormous landholdings generating steady income. They had military expertise and a fearsome reputation. They had the explicit blessing of the papacy. Indeed, they answered directly to the Pope, exempt from local bishops' authority, which gave them independence that sometimes created friction with church hierarchy, but also protected them from local political interference. And yet, individual Templars still lived the life described in the rule. They still rose for prayers in the dark hours before dawn. They still trained with weapons in the heat of the day. They still ate simple food and slept in common dormitories. They still owned nothing. The contradiction between personal poverty and institutional wealth was embedded in the very structure of the order, and it would never be fully resolved. Recruitment continued. Young men joined, drawn by piety or adventure or the promise of purpose. Some served for years and died in battle in the Holy Land, their names recorded in martyrologies, their souls, they believed, ascending directly to heaven. Others served in Europe, managing estates, training recruits, supporting the order's mission from a distance. Some rose through the ranks to positions of leadership. Others remained simple brother knights, following orders, doing their duty, content with a life of service. By 1180, roughly 60 years after Hugues de Payan approached King Baldwin with his strange proposal, the Templars numbered perhaps several thousand members, knights, sergeants, chaplains, support staff. Their land holdings were vast. Their reputation was formidable. They had transformed from 9 poor men with an idea into a military and organizational powerhouse. But they were still, fundamentally, warriors. Their primary identity was as defenders of the faith, fighters for Christ. The banking, the financial innovation that would define part of their legacy was still emerging, still secondary to their military mission. They held wealth and managed property, yes, but as a means to support warfare, not as an end in itself. That would begin to change gradually, as the practical needs of their operations pushed them toward financial innovation. But in the mid to late 12th century, they were still primarily what they had always claimed to be: the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, warrior monks who had successfully built an organization capable of supporting their sacred mission across the breadth of Christendom. The machinery of recruitment and expansion had worked almost too well, creating an institution of enormous power and wealth. Where that power and wealth would lead them, no one yet fully understood. The seeds of their greatest innovations, and eventually of their destruction, were being planted in the very success they had achieved. The Templars' wealth in land and castles created practical problems that would lead them, almost accidentally, into financial innovation. Let's think about what it meant to manage properties scattered across thousands of miles, in an age when communication travelled at the speed of a horse, when there were no banks as we understand them, when moving money physically meant loading coins onto pack animals and hoping they weren't stolen along the way. Imagine you're a Templar commander in Paris in, say, 1170. You have estates in your region that generate revenue, rents from peasants, sales of grain and wine, fees from mills. This revenue comes in as actual coins, silver pennies mostly, some gold when you're lucky. You need to send some of this money to support Templar operations in Jerusalem. How do you do it? You could load the coins onto a ship, send a trusted brother with armed guards to protect the money during the sea voyage, and the journey inland from the port. But ships sink. Guards can be bribed or overwhelmed by bandits. The physical transport of money across that distance was expensive, dangerous, and uncertain. Yet the need was real. Operations in Outremer required constant funding for equipment, supplies, castle maintenance, payments to support staff. The Templars developed a solution that seems obvious in hindsight, but was revolutionary at the time. Instead of moving the actual coins from Paris to Jerusalem, they moved information. They created what we would now call a letter of credit, though they didn't use that term. The system worked like this. A pilgrim preparing to travel to Jerusalem would come to a Templar preceptory in, say, France. He would deposit a sum of money, let's say £100 in silver to use a concrete example. The Templar commander would give him a receipt, a document written on parchment, sealed with wax, marked with specific codes and signatures that identified it as genuine. This document would state that the bearer had deposited £100 at the Paris temple and was entitled to withdraw the equivalent value in Jerusalem. The pilgrim would then make his journey carrying this document instead of the actual coins. If he was robbed, the bandits would get a piece of parchment that was worthless to them. They couldn't read the codes, couldn't replicate the seals, couldn't use it to withdraw money. The pilgrim, meanwhile, would still have his wealth represented by that document. When he arrived in Jerusalem, he would present the document to the Templar headquarters there. The Templars would verify it was genuine, checking the seals, the codes, perhaps comparing the handwriting to samples they had on file from the Paris preceptory. Once verified, they would give him the equivalent sum in local currency, whatever was current in Jerusalem at that time. He could then complete his pilgrimage, buy what he needed, make donations at holy sites, all without having risk carrying a fortune across 2,000 miles. Now you might wonder, how did the Jerusalem Templars have the funds to pay out what the Paris Templars had received? They didn't transfer the actual coins. We've established that was impractical. Instead, they relied on the fact that the system worked in both directions. While some pilgrims deposited money in Europe and withdrew it in Jerusalem, others, merchants who had done business in the East, crusaders returning home, officials collecting revenue, deposited money in Jerusalem and withdrew it in Europe. The flows roughly balanced over time. The Templars in each location held a treasury sufficient to honour the credits presented to them, trusting that the system as a whole remained in balance. This was a profound innovation. For the first time, money had been separated from its physical form. The value didn't travel, only information about the value travelled. This made long-distance transfer vastly safer, cheaper, and more reliable. It required trust, certainly. Trust that the Templars would honour their commitments, that the seals and codes couldn't be forged, that the system wouldn't collapse. But the Templars had built exactly the kind of reputation that enabled this trust. They were known to be honest, disciplined, and reliable. They had a presence in both the place where money was deposited and the place where it would be withdrawn. They had internal communication systems, with brothers regularly travelling between preceptories, carrying correspondence that could update account balances and verify transactions. Let's walk through a more detailed example to make this completely clear. Imagine you're a French merchant named Pierre in the year 1190. You've made a fortune in the wool trade and you want to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem as thanks to God for your prosperity. You have £300 in silver coins, which you'll need for your journey, for offerings, for the return trip. You go to the Templar preceptory in Paris. You meet with the brother in charge of financial matters, not a priest or a warrior, but a Templar who has proven himself skilled with numbers and records. You tell him you wish to deposit £300 against a letter of credit for Jerusalem. He agrees. You hand over your coins. He counts them carefully, witnessed by another brother to ensure honesty. He records the transaction in a ledger, noting your name, the amount, the date. Then he prepares your letter of credit. He writes it in Latin, the universal language of the church and educated people. He notes that Pierre the merchant has deposited £300 on this date and is entitled to withdraw the equivalent in Jerusalem. He adds specific details, perhaps a physical description of you, perhaps answers to security questions that only you would know, perhaps a code phrase. He seals it with the Templar seal, an image pressed into hot wax that would be difficult to forge. He might sign it with his own name, knowing that his handwriting is on file in Jerusalem and can be compared. You take this document and begin your journey. You travel light, relatively speaking. The parchment weighs nothing. You might sew it into the lining of your cloak or carry it in a sealed case. But either way, you're not weighed down by bags of coins. If bandits stop you on the road through Italy, they'll take your horse, your cloak, your provisions, but they'll get nothing of real value. You arrive in Jerusalem months later, dusty and tired but financially intact. You go to the Templar headquarters in Jerusalem. You present your letter of credit. The brother there examines it carefully. He checks the seal. Is the wax authentic? Does the image match the Paris seal they have on record? He reads the codes and descriptions. Perhaps he asks you the security questions noted in the document. Everything matches. He goes to his ledger and records that on this date he paid out the equivalent of £300 to Pierre the merchant against a credit issued in Paris. He gives you the money in whatever currency is current, perhaps bezants, the gold coins minted in Byzantium, or dinars, or a mix of currencies. You've successfully moved your wealth across Europe and the Mediterranean without physically moving the coins. Now, the Templars charged a fee for this service. They had to. The system cost money to operate, required maintaining treasuries in multiple locations, employed skilled staff, involved risk. The fee might be 2 or 3% of the total amount transferred, so on your £300, they might keep £6 or £9 as their fee. This was far less than the cost of hiring armed guards to physically transport coins, far less than the risk of losing everything to bandits or shipwreck. Was this fee interest? This is where things became theologically complicated. The Catholic Church strictly forbade usury, charging interest on loans. This prohibition was based on biblical passages and was taken very seriously. Jews, not bound by the same prohibition, often served as money lenders in medieval Europe, one reason they faced such hostility and persecution. Christians were not supposed to profit from lending money. Money, according to medieval economic thought, was sterile. It couldn't reproduce itself, so charging for its use was considered unnatural and sinful. But the Templars weren't exactly charging interest. They were charging a fee for a service, the service of safely transferring funds. They could argue, and did argue, that this was different from usury. When they charged 3% to transfer money from Paris to Jerusalem, they were being paid for their labour, for the risk they assumed, for the service they provided. It wasn't interest on a loan. This distinction was accepted by most church authorities, partly because the service was genuinely valuable, partly because the Templars had such strong backing from the papacy. As the system proved successful with pilgrims, it expanded to other uses. Merchants engaged in long-distance trade began using Templar services to move payments. Instead of a Venetian merchant travelling to Champagne to buy wool and bringing bags of gold coins, he could deposit the money with Templars in Venice, travel to Champagne with a letter of credit, and pay the wool merchants with funds withdrawn from the Templar preceptory there. This made trade safer and easier, facilitating commerce across Europe. nobles and kings began using Templar services as well. If a French count needed to send money to pay troops fighting in Spain, he could use the Templar network rather than organising his own risky convoy. If an English baron owed money to a Roman merchant, he could settle the debt through Templar transfer. The Templars became, in effect, a medieval wire transfer service. They also offered safekeeping. Nobles going on crusade would deposit their valuables, coins, jewellery, important documents, with the Templars for protection. The Templars would hold these items in secure vaults, give the depositor a receipt, and return everything upon demand. They charged a small fee for this service as well. This was useful for crusaders who knew they might be gone for years and wanted to ensure their wealth didn't disappear while they were away. Then came loans. This is where the Templars moved closer to modern banking. Kings and great nobles sometimes needed to borrow money, to finance wars, to build castles, to maintain their courts. The Templars, with their large treasuries and steady income from estates, had money to lend. They began making loans to some of the most powerful men in Europe. King Louis VII of France borrowed from the Templars to finance his participation in the Second Crusade. King Henry II of England used Templar loans. Later kings did the same. The Templars became, in modern terms, creditors to sovereign powers. They charged fees for these loans. Structured as payments for services or as gifts, or in other ways that technically didn't violate the usury prohibition, but that functionally served as interest. This was dangerous, though the Templars might not have fully realised it at the time. When you lend money to a king, you have a powerful debtor, but also a dangerous one. A king who owes you money might honour the debt, or he might find ways to avoid payment. He might pressure you to forgive the loan, or delay repayment indefinitely, or, in the worst case, simply take your assets by force and claim it's justified. The Templars were building relationships with monarchs that would eventually prove fatal, but in the 12th and 13th centuries, the immediate advantages seemed to outweigh the risks. The Paris Temple became the functional centre of Templar financial operations. It was a fortified complex in the heart of Paris, with thick walls, guarded entrances and vaults deep underground. The vaults held coins, jewellery, important documents, account books tracking deposits and withdrawals across the network. The brothers who worked there were not the romantic warrior monks of legend, but careful administrators, men skilled with numbers and writing, who spent their days maintaining ledgers and verifying documents. Kings of France used the Paris Temple as a treasury. They stored royal funds there. Knowing the Templar vaults were more secure than the royal palace, they had Templars manage accounts and make payments on their behalf. The treasurer of the temple became one of the most important financial officials in France, even though he was technically a monk who owned nothing personally. The Templars developed sophisticated accounting methods. They tracked deposits and withdrawals, maintained running balances, reconciled accounts between different preceptories. They used double-entry bookkeeping or something close to it, generations before Italian merchants would develop the system we use today. They had to. The complexity of their operations demanded rigorous record-keeping. A mistake in the ledgers could mean losing track of thousands of pounds, could undermine the trust that their whole system depended on. They also dealt in currency exchange. Europe in the 13th century didn't have a single currency. Every region, sometimes every city, minted its own coins. A pound in Paris wasn't the same as a pound in London, and neither was the same as a gold bezant from Byzantium. The Templars, operating across all these regions, had to know the exchange rates, had to convert from one currency to another. They made money on the exchange naturally, buying low in one currency, selling high in another, pocketing the difference. This was another service they could charge for. Another revenue stream in addition to their agricultural rents and donations. Think about what this meant in practice. A Templar clerk in the Paris Temple might, on a single day, receive a deposit from a pilgrim heading to Jerusalem, make a payment to a wool merchant on behalf of a nobleman, exchange Venetian ducats for French deniers for a travelling merchant, record a loan repayment from a baron, and update account balances for half a dozen preceptories that had sent messengers with letters updating their transactions. It was complex, demanding work that required trust, skill, and meticulous attention to detail. The system spread across the Templar network. Every major preceptory became a node in this financial network. London, Paris, Acre, Cyprus, Barcelona, Marseille, Rome, all could accept deposits, honour credits, make transfers, store valuables. A merchant could deposit money in London and withdraw it in Acre. A noble could store valuables in Paris and access them years later when he returned from Crusade. The network had value precisely because it was a network. The more locations it connected, the more useful it became to users. This was the Templars' great financial innovation. They didn't invent money or banking from nothing. Lending and money changing had existed since ancient times, but they created an international system of credit transfer that was unprecedented in scale and reliability. They built trust through their reputation and their organizational structure. They solved the practical problem of how to move value across vast distances in an age when moving physical objects was difficult and dangerous, and they did it not through deliberate planning to become bankers, but through solving practical problems related to their core mission. The irony was profound. They had started as poor fellow soldiers, emphasizing their poverty and their military purpose. Individual brothers still lived poorly, still owned nothing, still slept in common dormitories, and ate simple food. But their organization had become one of the most important financial institutions in Europe, managing treasuries for kings, facilitating international trade, creating the mechanisms that would eventually evolve into modern banking. They were warrior monks who happened to be bankers, or perhaps bankers who happened to be warriors. The line between their identities was becoming blurred in ways that their founders could never have imagined. They had built something remarkable, something that worked, something that would outlast them even after the order itself was destroyed. And they had done it, as they did everything. With discipline and careful attention to their rule, believing they were serving God's purpose even as they transformed medieval finance. By the year 1200, the Templars had reached a position of power that would have astonished Hugues de Payan and his 8 companions if they could have returned to see what their modest idea had become. The order now managed the financial affairs of kings, held castles across 3 continents, and operated what was effectively an international banking network. Let's explore what this looked like in practice, how the machinery of their power actually worked on a daily basis. The Templars' physical presence was enormous. They held more than 870 castles, preceptories and fortifications scattered across Christian Europe and the Crusader states. These weren't all massive fortress castles like the ones you might imagine from tales of knights and sieges. Many were simply fortified manor houses or administrative centres. But the scale was remarkable. In France alone, they had preceptories in nearly every region: Champagne, Burgundy, Provence, Languedoc, Brittany, Normandy. In England, they held the New Temple in London and dozens of regional centres. In Spain and Portugal. They held castles on the frontier with Muslim territories. In the Holy Land, they garrisoned some of the most important defensive positions. Each of these locations generated revenue and required management. Think about a Templar estate in rural France. Let's imagine one in Champagne, a region known for its agricultural wealth and its trade fairs. The estate might include several villages where peasants lived and worked. These peasants owed rent to their landlord, which was now the Templars. The rent might be paid in kind, a portion of the grain harvest, a number of chickens per year, days of labour work in Templar fields, or it might be paid in money, silver pennies counted out at fixed times during the year. The estate would have arable land where crops were grown, wheat, barley, oats. It would have meadows where sheep and cattle grazed. It would have forests that provided timber for construction and fuel, and where pigs could forage. It might have a vineyard producing wine, which in medieval France was both a staple beverage and a valuable trade good. It would have a mill where peasants brought their grain to be ground into flour, paying a fee for the service. The mill was a monopoly. Peasants were required to use the lord's mill, couldn't grind grain at home, making it a reliable source of income. All of this required management. Someone had to collect the rents, organise the planting and harvesting, maintain buildings, settle disputes, ensure that peasants fulfilled their obligations. The Templars assigned brothers to this work, not glamorous military service in the Holy Land, but essential administrative labour that kept the revenues flowing. These Templar estate managers had to understand agriculture, had to know the local customs and laws, had to be able to keep accounts and deal with the local nobility and church officials. The revenues from this one estate would be recorded in account books, coins would be stored in the local preceptory strongbox, and periodically a portion would be sent up the organisational hierarchy. Some money stayed local to maintain the preceptory and support the brothers living there. Some went to the regional commander, some eventually made its way to Paris, where the central treasury accumulated funds from across the Templar holdings. And from Paris, money would be sent to support operations in the Holy Land, buying armour and horses, paying for castle maintenance, purchasing supplies, supporting the military campaign that remained the Order's core mission. Multiply this single estate by hundreds, and you begin to see the scale of Templar operations. They were managing an economic empire that stretched across Christendom. They weren't just warriors who happened to own some land. They were sophisticated property managers, operating at a scale that few secular lords could match, and with an efficiency that came from their organisational discipline. The Paris Temple deserves particular attention, because it became the nerve centre of this entire operation. The complex occupied a substantial area in what is now the Marais district of Paris. It was surrounded by high walls and towers, creating a fortified enclosure in the heart of the city. Inside were chapels where brothers prayed, dormitories where they slept, training yards where they practiced military skills, stables for horses, workshops for craftsmen, and, most importantly for our purposes, the treasury. The treasury vaults were deep underground, accessible through guarded passages, with thick doors secured by multiple locks. Inside these vaults were chests containing gold and silver coins in various currencies. There were jewels and precious objects, left for safekeeping by nobles going on crusade or travelling abroad. There were important documents, deeds to properties, contracts, letters of credit, account books. The security was formidable, guards were always present, access was strictly controlled. The vaultmasters were brothers who had proven themselves absolutely trustworthy over years of service. But the real heart of the Paris Temple's operations was in the counting rooms and scriptoria where the clerks worked. These were Templar brothers who had been selected for their skills, with numbers and writing rather than for military prowess. They spent their days maintaining ledgers, recording transactions, preparing letters of credit, reconciling accounts from different preceptories, calculating exchange rates between currencies, and managing the complex web of deposits, withdrawals, transfers and loans that made up Templar banking operations. Imagine a typical day in these counting rooms in, say, the year 1215. A clerk arrives at dawn, having already attended morning prayers. He sits at a high desk in a room with other clerks, each at their own workspace. The room is lit by windows and in winter by candles that cast flickering light across the parchment. He opens the ledger he's working on, a large book bound in leather, pages of parchment covered in careful Latin script recording transactions. His first task might be recording deposits. A merchant arrives, wanting to deposit £50 before travelling to the Champagne fairs. The clerk counts the coins carefully, witnessed by another brother to prevent any question of dishonesty. He records the transaction, the date, the merchant's name, the amount, the purpose. He prepares a receipt for the merchant, sealed with the Templar seal. The coins go into a locked chest, which will later be carried down to the vaults under guard. Next, he might process a withdrawal. A pilgrim has arrived with a letter of credit issued by the Templar Preceptory in London, requesting withdrawal of £30 for his journey to Jerusalem. The clerk examines the document carefully. Is the seal genuine? Does the handwriting match samples on file from London? He asks questions to verify the pilgrim's identity. Satisfied, he records the withdrawal in his ledger and arranges for £30 to be given to the pilgrim. The letter of credit itself he keeps, filing it away as proof that the withdrawal was legitimate. Throughout the day, messengers arrive from other Templar preceptories, bringing letters updating account balances and reporting transactions. A preceptory in Provençal reports it has sent £200 toward the Paris treasury. A preceptory in Normandy requests £150 to purchase grain for storage. The clerk records all of this, keeping track of what each preceptory owes or is owed, maintaining the overall balance of the system. He might process a payment on behalf of the King of France. King Philip II has instructed the Templars to pay £300 to a group of Flemish mercenaries in royal service. The clerk records that the payment has been made from the royal account, updates the balance, prepares a receipt for the mercenaries and a notification for the king confirming the transaction has been completed. Currency exchange is another task. A Venetian merchant wants to convert 100 gold ducats into French deniers for purchases he plans to make. The clerk calculates the exchange rate, factors in the Templar fee for the service, counts out the appropriate number of deniers, and records the transaction. The gold ducats go into the vault, available for someone else who might want to convert deniers to ducats, or to be sent to a preceptory where ducats are more useful than French currency. By the end of the day, the clerk might have processed dozens of transactions. Everyone must be recorded accurately. Every coin must be accounted for. The system depended on trust, and trust depended on never making mistakes, never losing track of funds, never creating a situation where someone deposited money that couldn't be returned. The work was repetitive, detailed, demanding absolute concentration. It was as far from the battlefield glamour of crusading as you could imagine. But it was essential. The kings of France used the Paris temple almost as their official treasury. Royal revenues were stored there. Royal payments were processed there. The king could order the Templar treasurer to make payments on his behalf, and they would be carried out efficiently. This was partly because the Templar vaults were more secure than the royal palace. It was partly because the Templars had the administrative infrastructure to track complex accounts. And it was partly because having an outside institution manage your treasury provided a kind of credibility and stability. But it also meant the Templars knew intimate details about royal finances. They knew how much money the king had, what his expenses were, whether he was running deficits. They knew when he needed to borrow and how much. This knowledge was power, and it created a relationship of mutual dependency that was increasingly uncomfortable for both parties. The Templars made loans to monarchs with some regularity by the 13th century. King Edward I of England borrowed from the Templars multiple times to finance his campaigns in Wales and Scotland. The kings of France borrowed for their wars and for maintaining their courts. These were not small sums. A royal loan might be thousands of pounds, sometimes tens of thousands, enormous amounts in medieval terms. How did the Templars structure these loans to avoid the appearance of usury? The arrangements were complex and sometimes indirect. Sometimes the loan was described as an advance against future tax revenues. The king would assign certain taxes or revenues to the Templars, who would collect them directly until the debt was repaid. Sometimes there were fees charged for services associated with the loan, rather than interest on the principal. Sometimes valuable objects were pawned as security, and the Templars would keep any revenues generated by those objects until repayment. The exact mechanisms varied, but the functional result was the same. The Templars lent money to kings and profited from doing so. This made them valuable to monarchs who needed credit, but it also made them vulnerable. A king in debt might resent his creditors. He might look for ways to avoid repayment. The Templars were powerful, but monarchs were more powerful, and the relationship contained the seeds of future conflict. Beyond their financial operations, the Templars maintained their military identity. They still fought in the Crusader states. They still garrisoned castles. They still recruited warrior monks who took the same vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience that the original 9 had taken. A young nobleman joining the Templars in 1200 would go through the same reception ceremony, would be given the same white mantle, would live by the same rule that governed every aspect of life from prayer to combat. These warrior brothers might serve in various capacities during their lives. Perhaps they would begin in a European preceptory, training, learning the rule, proving themselves. Then they might be sent to the Holy Land, where they would garrison a castle, participate in campaigns, face actual combat. If they survived and showed aptitude, they might be promoted to positions of responsibility. Commander of a castle, marshal of a region, eventually perhaps one of the senior officers at the Order's headquarters. Or they might spend their whole career in military service, fighting and praying and living the austere life prescribed by the rule, dying eventually in battle or from disease. Believing they had earned their place in heaven, the paradox at the heart of the Templar Order grew more pronounced as the Order grew wealthier. Individual Templars still owned nothing. A knight who joined surrendered all personal property to the Order. He could not receive gifts, could not keep money, could not own even his clothing or weapons. Everything belonged to the Order. He slept in a common dormitory. He ate simple food. He followed strict discipline. If he broke the rule, he could be punished severely, even expelled. His life was hard, regulated, focused entirely on service, but the Order that same knight served owned estates worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. It held castles and fortifications. It managed the treasuries of kings. It operated ships and owned flocks of thousands of sheep. The collective wealth was immense, even as individual poverty remained absolute. Some observers found this troubling. How could an order dedicated to poverty be one of the richest institutions in Christendom? The Templars' answer remained consistent. Individual poverty kept them from corruption and ensured their spiritual purity, while organizational wealth enabled them to fulfill their mission of protecting pilgrims and defending the Holy Land. There was logic to this position, but the tension never fully resolved. Brothers managing wealthy estates in France lived very differently from brothers fighting in the parched hills of Outremer, even though both had taken identical vows. A Templar treasurer counting gold in the Paris vaults experienced the Order differently than a Templar sergeant standing watch on castle walls in the desert. They were part of the same organization, followed the same rule, but their daily realities diverged. By the early 13th century, the Grand Master of the Templars was one of the most powerful men in Christendom, advising popes and kings, commanding resources that rivaled those of many monarchs, making decisions that affected the fate of the Crusader states and the flow of commerce across Europe. Yet he still slept in a dormitory, still attended all 8 daily prayers, still owned nothing personally. He could command deployment of troops and allocation of thousands of pounds, but he couldn't keep a single coin for himself. This was the height of Templar power, extensive, wealthy, influential, respected. They had achieved everything they set out to achieve and more. They protected pilgrims through military force and financial innovation. They defended Christian territories in the Holy Land and in Spain. They facilitated trade and commerce. They served as trusted intermediaries and managers for the highest powers in the land. They had built something unprecedented, a truly international organization with unified command structure, coordinated operations across vast distances, and a reputation for competence and reliability that made them indispensable. But power always attracts envy, and success creates its own vulnerabilities. The Templars in 1200 couldn't see what was coming. They were too focused on their missions, too confident in their papal protections, too certain of the value they provided to monarchs and merchants alike. They had built an organization that worked brilliantly within the world as it existed. What they couldn't know was that the world was about to change in ways that would make their strengths into weaknesses, their success into a liability, their very indispensability into a reason for their destruction. But that transformation still lay decades in the future. For now, in the early 13th century, the Templars stood at the peak of their power, warrior monks managing an empire of faith and finance, convinced they were serving God's purpose, unaware that the very forces that had raised them up were already shifting beneath their feet. The Templars' position of power, as formidable as it seemed in the early 1300s, rested on foundations that were beginning to shift. The changes were subtle at first, easy to miss if you were living through them day by day, but looking back, we can see how circumstances were aligning in ways that would prove fatal to the order. Let's trace how success contained the seeds of destruction, how the very factors that made the Templars powerful also made them vulnerable. The most fundamental shift was the loss of the Holy Land. For nearly 2 centuries, the Crusader states had maintained a precarious existence along the eastern Mediterranean coast. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, these Christian territories had survived through a combination of military strength, diplomatic manoeuvring, and the disunity of their Muslim neighbours. But by the mid-1300s, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. In 1287, a relatively minor Kurdish military commander named Salah ad-Din, known to Europeans as Saladin, had unified Muslim forces and defeated the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin. He recaptured Jerusalem and reduced the Crusader states to a few coastal cities. The Third Crusade, led by kings of England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, managed to reclaim some territory, but not Jerusalem itself. The Crusader states survived but were permanently weakened, their territory reduced to narrow strips of coast. Over the following century, the Crusader presence in the Levant slowly contracted. Muslim forces, now united under increasingly effective leadership, pushed steadily against Christian positions. Castles fell, territory was lost. The Crusader population dwindled as fewer Europeans were willing to settle in what had become obviously unsustainable colonies. The Templars, along with their Hospitallers and other military orders, fought to defend what remained, but they were holding back an inevitable tide. On May 18th, 1291, the city of Acre fell to a Mamluk army led by Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil. Acre had been the last major Crusader stronghold, the administrative and commercial capital of what remained of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The siege lasted 6 weeks. The Templars and Hospitallers fought with characteristic courage, but they were overwhelmed by superior numbers. When the walls were breached, the Grand Master of the Templars, Guillaume de Beaujeu, was killed in the fighting. The city was taken, its Christian inhabitants killed or enslaved. The Crusaders who could evacuate fled to Cyprus, carrying what they could salvage. With the fall of Acre, the Crusader presence in the Holy Land effectively ended. There were still a few isolated castles held for a short time, but by 1291 it was clear that Christian rule in the Levant was finished. The dream that had motivated Pope Urban II in 1095, that had driven the First Crusade, that had sustained 2 centuries of European presence in the East, was over. For the Templars, this was existential crisis. Their entire reason for existence had been to protect pilgrims travelling to the Holy Land and to defend Christian territories there. What was their purpose now that those territories no longer existed? They retreated to Cyprus, an island kingdom that remained in Christian hands, and established their new headquarters there. But Cyprus was not the Holy Land. There were no pilgrims travelling through Cyprus who needed protection. There was no sacred mission that required warrior monks. Some Templars argued for planning a new crusade, for gathering forces to recapture what had been lost. They developed proposals for invading Egypt, for establishing a beachhead that could serve as a staging ground for reconquest. But these plans required resources that Christian Europe was increasingly unwilling to provide. The crusading enthusiasm that had motivated generations of Europeans was waning. People were tired of sending money and men to the east only to see them consumed in unsuccessful campaigns. The Templars still had their other missions. They continued fighting in Spain, where the Reconquista was ongoing and more successful. They continued managing their estates and their banking operations. They continued serving monarchs as treasurers and financial advisors. But these activities, while valuable, were not what the order had been founded to do. They were secondary missions that had grown to prominence because they were useful, but they lacked the spiritual clarity and urgency of the original calling. Other military orders faced the same crisis and adapted differently. The Hospitallers, also known as the Knights of St. John, shifted their focus to Rhodes, an island they would conquer and hold for centuries, creating a new stronghold in the eastern Mediterranean. The Teutonic Knights moved their operations to the Baltic region, crusading against pagan peoples in Prussia and Lithuania. Both orders found new missions that justified their continued existence. The Templars could have merged with the Hospitallers. This was proposed by Pope Clement V and others, a unified military order combining the resources and expertise of both organisations might have been formidable, but the Templars refused. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was institutional inertia. Perhaps they genuinely believed their identity and traditions were worth preserving separately. Whatever the reason, they insisted on remaining independent even as their original mission had vanished. This stubbornness would prove costly. An organisation without a clear purpose, particularly one that holds substantial wealth and power, becomes vulnerable. People begin to ask, why do we need them? What value do they provide that justifies their privileges and exemptions? These questions had easy answers when the Templars were defending the Holy Land. The answers became much harder when they were primarily managing estates and banking operations from their base in Cyprus. At the same time, the Templars' very success was creating resentment. Monarchs who used Templar financial services appreciated the convenience, but disliked the dependency. The Templars knew too much about royal finances. They held too much leverage as creditors. They enjoyed too many privileges, exemption from taxes, exemption from local bishop's authority, the right to maintain armed forces and fortifications. These privileges had been granted when the Templars were seen as essential to Christendom's defence. Now they seemed less justified. The Templars' wealth was increasingly conspicuous and increasingly resented. Common people saw Templar properties, saw the fortified preceptories, saw brothers riding fine horses, and wondered how this was consistent with vows of poverty. The fact that individual Templars owned nothing personally was a subtle distinction that most people didn't understand or care about. What they saw was a wealthy, powerful organisation of warrior monks who no longer had holy warriors' work to do. Rumours began to circulate. The Templars, people whispered, had strange initiation rites. New members had to perform secret ceremonies. They worshipped idols. They denied Christ. These rumours were almost certainly false, but they found receptive audiences. Secret organisations always attract conspiracy theories, and the Templars had always been somewhat secretive. Their receptions were private. Their chapter meetings were closed to outsiders. This had practical reasons. They discussed military strategy and financial matters that needed confidentiality. But secrecy breeds suspicion. There were also whispers about arrogance. The Templars, it was said, had grown proud. They refused to merge with the Hospitallers out of stubbornness. They resisted papal suggestions about reform. They acted as if they were beyond criticism. Some of this was probably true. Success and power tend to breed confidence that can shade into arrogance. An organisation that had operated independently for nearly 2 centuries, that had been praised by popes and kings, that had achieved extraordinary things, might well have developed institutional pride. Into this situation of declining purpose, growing resentment and circulating rumours stepped Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair. Philip was king from 1285 to 1314, and he desperately needed money. Let's understand Philip's position, because his character and circumstances were crucial to what would happen to the Templars. Philip inherited a kingdom that was superficially powerful but financially troubled. France was the largest and most populous kingdom in Western Europe. The French monarchy had been consolidating power for generations, slowly bringing rebellious nobles under control, expanding royal authority, building administrative structures. But this expansion required money, to pay administrators, to maintain armies, to construct buildings, to compete in prestige with other monarchs. Philip fought expensive wars. He warred with England over territories in Gascony and Flanders. He warred with Flanders itself when that wealthy region rebelled against French rule. Wars in the medieval period were ruinously expensive. You had to recruit soldiers, which meant paying wages or providing land. You had to buy equipment and supplies. You had to besiege castles, which could take months, during which you were paying an army to sit outside walls. Even victories could be financially devastating if they cost more to achieve than the conquered territory was worth. Philip's financial situation was made worse by his own spending. He maintained an elaborate court, built impressive buildings, projected an image of royal magnificence that he believed necessary to demonstrate his power and legitimacy. He couldn't appear poor or weak. That would invite challenges to his authority. But magnificence required money he often didn't have. He tried various expedients to raise funds. He debased the currency, reducing the precious metal content in coins while maintaining their face value. This was a form of inflation that allowed him to pay debts with cheaper money, but it angered merchants and ordinary people who saw their savings lose value. He taxed the clergy, which brought him into conflict with Pope Boniface VIII. A confrontation that became bitter and personal. When some of Philip's agents kidnapped and assaulted the elderly Pope at Anagni in 1303, the scandal reverberated across Christendom. Boniface died shortly after, and while Philip's direct responsibility was debatable, his willingness to confront papal authority so violently revealed the lengths he would go to assert his will. He seized the property of Italian banking families operating in France when they couldn't collect debts he owed them. He expelled Jews from France in 1306, confiscating their property and cancelling debts owed to them. This was both profitable and popular with certain segments of French society, but it disrupted the economy and demonstrated Philip's ruthlessness when he needed money. Through all of this, Philip owed substantial sums to the Templars. Like his father and grandfather before him, he had borrowed from the order to finance his campaigns and expenditures. The exact amounts are disputed by historians, but they were significant. The Templars served as his treasurers, managing royal funds, making payments on his behalf. They knew the state of royal finances better than almost anyone. They knew Philip was, in modern terms, running chronic deficits, borrowing to pay current expenses, struggling to service existing debts. For Philip, this situation was intolerable. He was King of France, the most powerful monarch in Christendom. Yet he was financially dependent on an order of warrior monks. He owed them money. They knew his financial secrets. They enjoyed privileges and exemptions from his authority. And increasingly, they seemed to serve no essential purpose. The Holy Land was lost. The Crusading era was ending. What were the Templars for? Except managing wealth that Philip believed should be his. Philip was not a man constrained by moral scruples when his interests were at stake. He had already demonstrated his willingness to confiscate property from Jews and Italian bankers. He had confronted the Pope himself. The Templars, wealthy and vulnerable, must have seemed an obvious target. If he could destroy the order and seize its assets, he could solve his financial problems, eliminate his creditors, and remove an organisation that enjoyed too much independence from royal control. But he couldn't simply attack the Templars openly. They were a religious order under papal protection. They had powerful friends and supporters across Europe. They had a reputation for piety and service that, despite rumours, remained largely positive. Philip needed a justification that would make destroying them acceptable, even praiseworthy. He needed charges so serious that the Templars' defenders would be silenced, so shocking that public opinion would turn against the order, Heresy was the answer. Accusations of heresy in medieval Europe were devastating. The Church took heresy with absolute seriousness, viewing it as spiritual poison that could damn souls and destroy Christendom. The Inquisition, established in the 1300s to combat heresy, had developed sophisticated methods of interrogation and prosecution. If the Templars could be convincingly accused of heresy, their papal protections would evaporate, their supporters would abandon them, and their wealth could be legitimately confiscated. Philip began gathering information, building a case. He had informants, possibly including former Templars who had been expelled from the order for disciplinary reasons and bore grudges. These informants provided details about Templar reception ceremonies, about chapter meetings, about practices that could be interpreted or misinterpreted as heretical. Philip's agents compiled this information into a dossier of charges that would be unveiled at the right moment. The Templars seemed unaware of the gathering storm. They continued their operations, managing estates, conducting banking transactions, training recruits. The Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, had served in various positions within the order for decades. He was a capable administrator, but perhaps not a particularly imaginative or politically astute leader. He seems not to have recognized how vulnerable the order had become, how the loss of the Holy Land had undermined their position, how royal resentment and financial desperation were creating mortal danger. Other observers might have seen warning signs. Pope Clement V, elected in 1305, was French and had connections to Philip. He had suggested merging the Templars and Hospitallers, which the Templars had rejected. He had requested that Grand Master Jacques de Molay come to France to discuss the future of the military orders, and de Molay had complied, arriving in 1307. This brought the head of the Templar order directly into Philip's territory, into the reach of royal power. The elements were aligning, a monarch desperate for money and willing to use any means to get it, an organisation that was wealthy, privileged, and increasingly purposeless. Rumours and suspicions that could be amplified into accusations, a pope who was politically weak and dependent on French support, and a legal framework, the Inquisition and heresy prosecution, that could be weaponized for political ends. The Templars had survived 2 centuries through military prowess, financial innovation, and papal protection. But military prowess was irrelevant when you couldn't identify your enemy until too late. Financial innovation had made them wealthy, but also made them targets. And papal protection depended on a strong, independent pope, which Clement V was not. The order that had seemed impregnable in 1200 looked, by 1307, vulnerable in ways its members didn't fully comprehend. Philip was patient. He gathered his evidence, coordinated with his advisors, planned his move carefully. He needed to strike decisively, to arrest Templars across France simultaneously so they couldn't flee or organize resistance. He needed to have his charges ready, his interrogators prepared, his legal justifications established. He was planning to destroy one of the most powerful institutions in Christendom, and he needed to do it in a way that would be accepted, that would be seen as justified, that would allow him to seize Templar wealth without appearing to be simply a thief on a grand scale. The Templars in France in 1307, going about their daily routines, managing estates, processing deposits and withdrawals, training in their preceptories, praying their 8 daily offices, had no idea what was coming. They believed their service was valued, their organisation secure, their future assured. They had survived the loss of the Holy Land. They had adapted to new circumstances. They were still needed, still useful, still protected by the highest authority in Christendom. They were wrong. The world had changed in ways they hadn't recognised. Success had made them complacent. Wealth had made them targets. Loss of purpose had made them expendable. And a ruthless king with empty coffers had decided they were worth more to him destroyed than preserved. The machinery of their destruction was already in motion, driven by forces much larger than any individual's malice, but focused through one man's desperate need for money and power. The Templars stood at the precipice, unaware that the ground beneath them was already crumbling, that within weeks their world would shatter in ways that would echo through centuries. Philip struck on Friday, October 13th, 1307. The date would become legendary, possibly the origin of the superstition about Friday the 13th being unlucky. Though the connection is debated by historians, what is not debatable is that this Friday was catastrophically unlucky for the Knights Templar. Let's move slowly through what happened, understanding both the mechanics of the arrests and what they meant for the people involved. Philip's planning had been meticulous and secret. He had prepared sealed orders and sent them to his officials across France, with instructions that they were not to be opened until the night of Thursday, October 12th. This ensured that news of what was planned couldn't leak and allow Templars to flee or prepare resistance. When the orders were opened, they commanded the simultaneous arrest of all Templars in France at dawn on Friday. Royal officials, bailiffs and sergeants appeared at Templar preceptories across the kingdom as the sun rose on that October morning. The Templars were taken completely by surprise. These were not military raids. The Templars were not given opportunity to resist. They were simply informed they were under arrest by order of the king, charged with heresy, and taken into custody. In Paris, the temple itself was occupied. In regional preceptories across France, from Normandy to Provence, Templars were rounded up. The operation was coordinated and comprehensive. Imagine you are a Templar brother in a preceptory in rural France. You have risen for matins, prayed in the chapel, perhaps were preparing for the day's work, managing the estate, training, administrative duties. Suddenly armed men arrive with royal authority. They arrest you and your brother Templars. You're confused, perhaps angry, demanding to know the charges. You're told you have been accused of heresy, that you will be tried, that you must come with them immediately. You're taken from the only home you have known for years, from the brotherhood that defined your identity, and imprisoned. The charges, when they were made public, were shocking. The Templars, it was claimed, engaged in heretical practices during their secret reception ceremonies. Specifically, they were accused of denying Christ, of spitting on the cross, of worshipping an idol they called Baphomet, of engaging in obscene rituals including homosexual acts. These charges struck at the very heart of the order's identity as defenders of Christianity. If true, they would mean the Templars were not pious warrior monks but secret heretics, their entire existence a blasphemous fraud. The arrests swept up the entire Templar hierarchy in France. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, was arrested in Paris. He had been in France at the invitation of the Pope to discuss the future of the military orders, completely unaware that he was walking into a trap. Senior commanders, treasurers, knights, sergeants, chaplains, all were taken. Hundreds of Templars were imprisoned across France, held in royal and ecclesiastical prisons awaiting interrogation. Philip moved quickly to justify his actions to the wider world. He sent letters to other European monarchs explaining the arrests, detailing the charges, portraying himself as defender of the faith who had uncovered a terrible heresy festering within Christendom. He sent representatives to Pope Clement V, presenting evidence and asking for papal support. He needed Clement's backing because the Templars were a religious order under papal jurisdiction. Without papal approval, Philip's actions could be seen as an illegal attack on the church itself. Clement's initial response was one of shock and resistance. He wrote to Philip expressing surprise at the arrests, noting that the Templars were under papal protection and could not be arrested by secular authorities without his permission. He suspended the inquisitors who were preparing to try the Templars, asserting that this was a matter for papal jurisdiction, not royal. For a brief moment it seemed Clement might stand up to Philip, might protect the order, might demand their release. But Clement was in a weak position. He was French, had been elected pope with Philip's support and resided in Avignon rather than Rome, making him geographically and politically dependent on French goodwill. Philip pressured him relentlessly. Philip had public opinion on his side, as the charges against the Templars, whether true or false, had shocked people across France. Philip threatened to charge Clement's predecessor, Pope Boniface VIII, posthumously with heresy, which would have created a scandal that might bring down Clement as well. Gradually, Clement gave way. He didn't endorse Philip's actions fully, but he didn't stop them either. His resistance became token, his criticisms muted. Meanwhile, the interrogations began. The prisoners were questioned by inquisitors, specialists in extracting confessions of heresy, who had developed methods that, while considered legally proper in their time, we would recognize as torture. Let's be clear about what this meant without dwelling on graphic details. Medieval interrogation could include stretching on the rack, application of burning materials to feet, sleep deprivation, psychological pressure, and other techniques designed to break the will. The stated purpose was to save souls by forcing heretics to confess, repent, and return to the church. The practical result was that people confessed to whatever their interrogators wanted to hear. Under this pressure, many Templars confessed. Jacques de Molay himself, the Grand Master, confessed to denying Christ and spitting on the cross during his own reception into the order decades earlier. Other senior Templars confessed to similar acts. They admitted that reception ceremonies included heretical elements, that they had been taught to deny Christ, that the order's practices were blasphemous. These confessions were exactly what Philip needed. They seemed to confirm the charges, to prove that the accusations were true, to justify the arrests and the coming destruction of the order. But we need to understand these confessions in context. They were extracted under torture from men who had been suddenly arrested, imprisoned, separated from their brothers, subjected to psychological and physical pressure designed specifically to break resistance. Medieval legal procedure accepted confessions obtained this way as valid, viewing torture as a legitimate tool for discovering truth. We now know that torture produces unreliable information. People will say anything to make the pain stop. But in 1307, confessions under torture were considered legally binding and spiritually meaningful. Some Templars resisted. They denied the charges, refused to confess even under torture, maintained their innocence. These men showed extraordinary courage, enduring suffering while insisting that the accusations were lies, that the order was faithful, that they had done nothing wrong. Their resistance mattered, because it showed that not all Templars confessed, that the narrative of universal guilt was false, but their suffering also demonstrated the terrible power of the machinery arrayed against the order. The confessions presented a problem for those Templars who made them. In the days and weeks after confessing, removed from immediate torture, some began to reconsider. They recanted their confessions, saying they had lied under duress, that the charges were false, that they had only confessed to escape the pain. These recantations were, in the logic of the Inquisition, proof of relapse. Having confessed and then denied the confession meant returning to heresy after appearing to repent. The penalty for relapsed heresy was death by burning. So some Templars were burned at the stake, not immediately after arrest, but in the months and years that followed, as trials proceeded and prisoners were convicted. These men were led to public squares, tied to stakes, surrounded by wood that was lit. They died in agony, in front of crowds who had gathered to witness the execution of heretics. The stated purpose was to purify their souls through fire and to serve as warning to others. The actual result was terror that encouraged other Templars to maintain their confessions rather than risk recanting. The trials created a terrible dilemma for arrested Templars. If you denied the charges, you faced continued torture until you confessed. If you confessed, you bore false witness against yourself and your order and lived with that lie. If you confessed and then recanted, you faced death. There were no good options, only choices between different forms of suffering and degradation. Jacques de Molay's behaviour during this period was complex and, to modernise, somewhat difficult to understand. He confessed under torture, then seemed to support the confessions publicly, appearing before assemblies and speaking about the order's guilt. But he also sent secret messages to other Templars encouraging them to resist, suggesting his public statements were coerced. His position was impossible. He was the leader of the order but held prisoner, publicly confessing but privately maintaining innocence, trying to navigate between survival and integrity in circumstances where either seemed unlikely. Pope Clement, under pressure from Philip but also genuinely concerned about the charges, convened ecclesiastical commissions to investigate. Templars were examined by church officials in addition to royal inquisitors. The trials expanded beyond France as Philip convinced other European monarchs to arrest Templars in their territories and conduct their own investigations. The charges against the Templars became an international affair, with trials occurring in England, Aragon, Italy, Cyprus, Germany, and other territories. The results varied by region. In France, where Philip controlled the process, virtually all examined Templars eventually confessed under torture. In England, King Edward II initially resisted arresting the Templars, who had served his father loyally. When he did arrest them, the English judicial system, which did not routinely use torture, produced far fewer confessions. Many English Templars denied the charges and were eventually acquitted or given minor penances. In Aragon, the trials were inconclusive. In Italy and Germany, results were mixed. The pattern suggested that where torture was applied systematically, confessions followed. Where it was not, Templars maintained their innocence. This raises the crucial question: were the charges true? Did the Templars actually engage in heretical practices? The answer matters, both historically and for understanding what happened to them. Let's think about this carefully, weighing the evidence as fairly as we can from the distance of 7 centuries. The evidence for the charges comes almost entirely from confessions extracted under torture and from a few informants whose credibility is questionable. There are no contemporary accounts from outside observers describing heretical Templar practices. There are no documents from within the order discussing or prescribing the alleged rituals. The charges themselves, denying Christ, spitting on the cross, worshipping an idol called Baphomet, seem designed to hit every major category of heresy that medieval people feared. They have a formulaic quality, as if someone compiled a list of the worst possible religious crimes and attributed them all to the Templars. Some elements of the accusations might have been distortions of actual Templar practices. The reception ceremony was secret, conducted in closed chapter meetings. This secrecy was practical. The Templars discussed military strategy and financial matters that needed confidentiality, but secrecy always breeds suspicion. It's possible that some elements of the reception ceremony, taken out of context or misunderstood, were reinterpreted as heretical. For example, there might have been tests of obedience that involved orders to deny Christ, which initiates were expected to refuse, demonstrating their faith. Such a practice, described by a hostile interrogator to a frightened prisoner, might be confessed as actual denial of Christ. The idol Baphomet presents particular puzzles. Some confessions described it as a head, others as a cat, others differently. No such idol was ever found in any Templar preceptory despite extensive searches. The name itself may be a corruption of Mahomet, Muhammad, suggesting confusion between Muslims and heretics in the medieval mind. Or it may have been invented whole cloth by interrogators and repeated by prisoners who were told what to say. The homosexual act alleged in the charges may reflect medieval attitudes more than Templar reality. All male religious communities living in close quarters were often suspected of such behaviour, whether accurately or not. The charges may simply have been including accusations that were standard in heresy prosecutions, applying a template to the Templars. Modern historians, examining all available evidence, have reached a broad consensus. The charges against the Templars were almost certainly false, fabricated by Philip to justify his seizure of their property and destruction of an order he found threatening and inconvenient. The confessions were products of torture, not revelations of actual heresy. The Templars were not perfect, no human institution is, but they were not the secret heretics Philip claimed they were. This means the trials were show trials, the confessions coerced lies, the executions judicial murders. The Templars died not because they had committed crimes, but because a king wanted their money, and their destruction served his political purposes. The machinery of law and religion was used to give legitimacy to what was essentially theft and murder on a massive scale. But understanding this from our perspective doesn't change what it meant to live through. For the Templars imprisoned across Europe in 1307 and the years following, the truth of the charges mattered less than the power of those making them. They were trapped in a system where denial meant torture, confession meant dishonour, and recantation meant death. Many chose confession, hoping to survive, accepting the stain on their honour as the price of life. Some chose to maintain innocence regardless of cost, dying under torture or at the stake rather than bear false witness. Others tried to navigate between these poles, confessing and recanting and confessing again, trying to find some path through the nightmare that would preserve both life and integrity. Jacques de Molay, imprisoned in Paris, watched the order he had led for years be destroyed piece by piece. Templars across Europe were arrested, tried, convicted. Properties were seized. The network of preceptories was dismantled. The banking operations ceased. The carefully maintained accounts and records were confiscated. Everything the order had built over nearly 2 centuries was being torn down, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He had confessed under torture, and the confession had given credibility to the charges against the entire order. His efforts to recant or resist were ineffective. He could only watch and endure and wait to see what final fate awaited him and the remains of his brotherhood. The arrests of October 13th, 1307, marked the beginning of the end for the Knights Templar. From that day forward, they were fighting for survival against overwhelming force, royal power, inquisitorial procedure, torture, public opinion shaped by shocking charges. They would fight on for years through trials and appeals and diplomatic manoeuvring, but the outcome was never really in doubt once Philip had struck that first coordinated blow. The warrior monks who had survived 2 centuries of crusading, who had built an international organisation of extraordinary sophistication, who had innovated medieval banking and finance, were brought down by accusations whispered in torture chambers and enforced by legal proceedings that were tools of political power rather than justice. The tragedy was profound, the injustice clear, but the result was inevitable once the machinery had been set in motion on that October morning, when dawn broke over France and armed men appeared at Templar gates across the kingdom. The trials dragged on for years, through 1308, 1309, 1310. 1311. Individual Templars were tried in various jurisdictions across Europe. Some were acquitted, some were convicted and executed. Many remained in prison, their fates uncertain, the legal proceedings grinding forward with medieval slowness. But the ultimate fate of the order itself was decided not in courtrooms, but in the political manoeuvring between Pope Clement V and King Philip IV. Clement was in an impossible position. He was Pope, theoretically the supreme authority in Christendom, but he was dependent on Philip's support and unable to resist French pressure effectively. He had initially tried to protect the Templars, asserting papal jurisdiction, suspending the inquisitors Philip had set to work. But Philip had countered by convening the Estates General, an assembly of French nobles and clergy, which had declared the Templars guilty and demanded their suppression. This gave Philip's actions the appearance of popular support, making resistance more difficult. Clement called for a church council to decide the fate of the order. The Council of Vienne, named for the city in southeastern France where it convened, opened in October of 1311. Bishops and church officials from across Christendom gathered to address various matters of church reform and policy. But the question of the Templars dominated the proceedings. The council heard evidence from both sides. Templar defenders, including some brothers who had been allowed to travel to Vienne, argued that the charges were false, that the confessions had been extracted through torture, that the order should be reformed rather than destroyed. They pointed to the varied results of trials across Europe, the acquittals in England, the inconclusive proceedings elsewhere, as evidence that the charges were not universally proven. But Philip's representatives presented the confessions obtained in France, detailed the allegations, and argued that an order so corrupted could not be reformed but must be eliminated entirely. Philip himself travelled to Vienne with an armed force, a not so subtle reminder of his power and his determination to see the Templars destroyed. His presence intimidated the council delegates and made clear that resistance would have consequences. Clement, caught between his papal responsibilities and political reality, found a solution that was legally creative but morally compromised. On March 22, 1312, he issued the papal bull Vox in excelso. In it he did not condemn the Templars as heretics. Doing so would require definitive proof that was lacking. Instead, he suppressed the order by papal decree, declaring that it was dissolved not because it was proven guilty, but because its reputation was so damaged that it could no longer fulfill its mission. The order was ended by administrative action rather than judicial conviction, a distinction that had legal significance but provided little comfort to the Templars who had maintained their innocence. A second bull, ad profidam, dealt with the disposition of Templar property. The properties were to be transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, the other major military order, to continue supporting efforts to reclaim the Holy Land. This meant, at least in theory, that Templar wealth would remain dedicated to its original purpose. In practice, the transfer was complicated and incomplete. Many properties had already been seized by monarchs, others were tangled in legal disputes. The Hospitallers eventually received a portion of former Templar holdings, but not all, and not without years of negotiations and payments. Individual Templars faced varied fates depending on their circumstances and locations. Those who had confessed and maintained their confessions were generally allowed to join other religious orders or were given pensions and released. Those who had never confessed and had been acquitted were also released. But those who had confessed and then recanted faced the harshest punishment. They were considered relapsed heretics, and the penalty was death. In France, 54 Templars who had recanted their confessions were burned at the stake in Paris on a single day in May of 1310, before the Council of Vienne had even convened. They were led to a field outside the city, tied to stakes, surrounded by wood and brush that was set alight. They died proclaiming their innocence and the innocence of the order, their voices raised in prayer as the flames consumed them. Witnesses reported that they faced death with courage, which impressed some observers but did nothing to save them. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, remained imprisoned in Paris throughout the trials and council proceedings. His confession early in the persecution had damaged the order's defence, but he had also tried to resist, sending messages of encouragement to other Templars, maintaining in some contexts that the charges were false. His position was ambiguous, his behaviour during imprisonment difficult to interpret. Some historians view him as weak for confessing, others as pragmatic for trying to survive, still others as a tragic figure caught in circumstances beyond his control. In March of 1314, nearly 7 years after his arrest, de Molay's final fate was decided. He and 3 other senior Templar leaders, Geoffroy de Charnay, Hugues de Perrot, and Geoffroy de Gonneville, were brought before a papal commission in Paris to receive their sentences. They had confessed and maintained those confessions through years of imprisonment. The commission expected to sentence them to life imprisonment, the standard punishment for confessed heretics who showed repentance. But on March 18th, 1314, standing on a scaffold erected in front of Notre Dame Cathedral, Jacques de Molay did something unexpected. When asked to publicly confirm his confession one final time before being sentenced, he instead loudly recanted. He declared that the charges against the order were false, that he had only confessed under torture and fear that the Templars were innocent. Geoffroy de Charnay joined him in this recantation. After 7 years of imprisonment, facing life in prison but perhaps hoping for eventual release, or simply unable to die with a lie, they chose to tell the truth. This was not what Philip wanted to hear. A public recantation by the Grand Master undermined the entire narrative of Templar guilt. According to the rules of the Inquisition, relapsed heretics, those who confessed then recanted, were to be handed over to secular authorities for execution. Philip acted swiftly. That same day, before the papal commission could deliberate or before any appeals could be made, he ordered de Molay and de Charny executed as relapsed heretics. They were taken to a small island in the Seine called the Île aux Juifs, where a scaffold and stake had been prepared. In the early evening, as the sun set over Paris, the 2 elderly men were tied to stakes and burned alive. Contemporary accounts, written by observers sympathetic and hostile alike, agree that they faced death with courage. They proclaimed their innocence and the innocence of the order. They prayed aloud as the flames rose. And according to some accounts, Jacques de Molay, in his final moments, issued a curse. He called on God to witness that Philip and Clement had destroyed an innocent order through lies and greed. He summoned them to appear before God's judgment within a year to answer for their crimes. Whether he actually said these words or whether they were added later to the story, we cannot know for certain. Medieval chroniclers sometimes embellished events to fit narrative patterns, and a dying man's curse made for compelling storytelling. What is certain is what happened next. Pope Clement V died on April 20th, 1314, just 33 days after de Molay's execution. He had been ill for some time, suffering from what was probably cancer or another serious disease. His death was not unexpected given his condition, but the timing so soon after de Molay's curse struck contemporaries as remarkable. King Philip IV died on November 29th, 1314, just 8 months after de Molay. He died from a stroke while hunting in the forest of Fontainebleau. He was 46 years old, relatively young, and had seemed in good health. His death was sudden and unexpected. Again, the proximity to de Molay's curse seemed meaningful to medieval minds that were attuned to divine providence and supernatural causation. Did de Molay's curse kill them? Of course not. We understand disease and stroke as natural processes. But the coincidence fed the legend. The story of the Grand Master's curse became part of Templar mythology, repeated and embellished over centuries. It gave the Order's destruction a narrative closure, suggested that divine justice had punished the guilty, even if earthly justice had failed the innocent. Whether de Molay cursed them or not, the story captured a truth, that Philip and Clement had done something terrible, and that history would judge them harshly for it. With the deaths of Philip and Clement, with the execution of de Molay and the suppression of the Order, the Knights Templar as an institution ceased to exist. But thousands of individual Templars still lived, and their fates varied widely depending on where they were and what their circumstances had been. Many Templars were absorbed into other religious orders. Those who had never been convicted of heresy, or who had been acquitted, or who had confessed and done penance, were allowed to join the Hospitallers or Benedictine monasteries or other orders. They continued living as monks, following a religious rule, but without the distinctive Templar identity. Some probably adapted well, finding peace in a less militarized form of religious life. Others likely struggled, never fully belonging to their new communities, always remembering what they had lost. Some Templars were given pensions and released into secular life. This was particularly common in regions where trials had ended in acquittal, or where evidence against individual brothers was weak. These men, having spent years or decades as Templars, now had to navigate a world they had withdrawn from. They had to find places to live, ways to support themselves, identities beyond the brotherhood that had defined them. Some probably rejoined families if they still had living relatives. Others disappeared into obscurity, living out their remaining years in quiet anonymity. Some Templars simply vanished. The order had been international, with preceptories and holdings across Europe and in Cyprus. When the suppression came, some brothers in remote locations might have avoided arrest entirely, might have shed their Templar mantles and disappeared into the general population. Others might have fled to regions beyond Christian Europe's reach. There are legends about Templars fleeing to Scotland, which was in political turmoil and might not have enforced papal decrees. There are stories about Templars joining merchant expeditions or seeking refuge in the East. Most of these stories are probably fabrications. But it's possible that some individual Templars did escape and build new lives beyond the reach of Philip's agents. The question of Templar treasure has fascinated people for centuries. According to legend, the Templars possessed vast wealth. Not just the documented estates and revenues, but secret treasures hidden in their vaults, possibly including holy relics acquired in the Crusades or ancient artifacts discovered under the Temple Mount. When Philip's agents raided Templar preceptories in October of 1307, they expected to find these treasures. They were disappointed. The inventories of property seized from Templar holdings show substantial wealth, but nothing extraordinary. Coins, certainly, church vessels and vestments, account books and documents, weapons and armour. The normal contents of military religious houses, but not the enormous secret treasures that rumour suggested. Either those treasures never existed, which is likely, or they had been moved before the arrests. There are stories about the Templar fleet disappearing from La Rochelle, a major port on France's Atlantic coast, shortly before or after the October arrests. According to these stories, Templar ships loaded with treasure sailed away, perhaps to Scotland, perhaps across the Atlantic. Some very speculative theories suggest Templars reached America, though there's no credible evidence for this. What probably happened, if anything, is that some Templar ships that were at sea or in port when the arrests occurred simply sailed away to avoid seizure, and their cargoes, whatever they were lost to history. Philip did not get all the wealth he expected from destroying the Templars. The documented revenues from Templar estates were substantial but not enormous. Much of the property was transferred to the Hospitallers, though only after Philip extracted payments and kept some choice holdings for the crown. The costs of the trials, imprisonments, and administration of seized properties consumed much of what was gained. Philip's financial situation did improve. He was no longer in debt to the Templars, and he did acquire some of their wealth, but he did not solve all his financial problems. He continued struggling with deficits and debasing currency until his death. The Hospitallers, who received most Templar property, found the inheritance a mixed blessing. They gained substantial estates that increased their resources, but they also inherited the resentment that the Templars' wealth and privileges had generated. They had to pay compensation to monarchs who had seized Templar properties in their territories. They faced increased scrutiny and pressure. The windfall made them more powerful but also more vulnerable to the same pressures that had destroyed the Templars. The suppression of the Templars disrupted medieval banking. The network that had enabled secure transfer of funds across Europe was destroyed. The institutional knowledge, the careful record-keeping, the encryption systems, the trust networks, was lost. For merchants and pilgrims who had relied on Templar services, the suppression created practical problems. How do you safely move money from Paris to Jerusalem now? How do you store valuables securely when travelling? Other banking families filled the vacuum. Italian merchant families, the Medici, the Peruzzi, the Bardi and others, had been developing banking operations parallel to the Templars. They expanded to meet the demand for financial services that Templar suppression created. These families would dominate European banking for the next several centuries, developing the practices that would evolve into modern banking. They learned from Templar innovations, letters of credit, account transfers, currency exchange, while avoiding the mistake of becoming too powerful and too independent from political authority. The destruction of the Templars demonstrated a harsh lesson about the relationship between financial power and political power. The Templars had become wealthy and influential through providing valuable services. But wealth without political protection was vulnerable. When they lost their core mission with the fall of the Holy Land, when they made enemies in the form of indebted monarchs, their wealth became liability rather than asset. A creditor, no matter how rich, can be destroyed by a sovereign debtor who has the will and means to do so. This lesson was not lost on future banking families. They would be more careful about lending to sovereigns, would demand better security, would maintain political flexibility, would avoid becoming too powerful or too threatening. The memory of the Templars' fate hung over medieval and Renaissance banking like a warning. Be useful, be profitable, but never become so independent or so powerful that you appear to be a threat to royal authority. By 1315, the year after Desmoulins' execution, the Knights Templar existed only in memory and scattered individuals. The preceptories were empty or occupied by hospitallers. The white mantles with red crosses were gone. The accounts were closed. The banking operations had ceased. An organisation that had existed for nearly 200 years, that had shaped the Crusades and medieval finance, that had built a network spanning Christendom, had been erased in less than a decade. The brothers who had survived, pensioned, absorbed into other orders, fled, or simply released, lived on with their memories of what had been. They had been part of something extraordinary, an order that combined military valour with monastic discipline, that pioneered international banking while maintaining vows of poverty, that served popes and kings while answering ultimately to God. They had believed their service mattered, their mission was sacred, their brotherhood was eternal, and they had watched it all destroyed by greed and political calculation, disguised as concern for religious purity. Jacques de Molay died proclaiming innocence, and history has vindicated him. The charges were false, the confessions were coerced, the trials were show trials. The suppression was an act of political violence given legal cover through manipulation of religious authority. The Templars were not perfect, no human institution is, but they were not the heretics Philip claimed. They were destroyed not because they deserved it, but because they were vulnerable and valuable, because a king needed money and power, and because the mechanisms of medieval law could be weaponized for political purposes. The tragedy of the Templars was not just in their deaths, or the dissolution of their order. It was in the perversion of justice, in the use of torture to manufacture truth, in the complicity of religious authority with political power, in the demonstration that service and loyalty provided no protection against determined royal will. They had served Christendom for 2 centuries, and Christendom destroyed them. The irony was bitter, the injustice profound, but the historical pattern was depressingly familiar. Power destroys what it no longer needs, and finds justifications afterward. The Templars vanished as an organisation, but their innovations and their story endured. Let's explore what they left behind, both the practical contributions they made to medieval finance and commerce, and the myths and legends that grew around their memory. Because the Templars have 2 legacies, what they actually accomplished and what people have imagined they accomplished. Both matter in different ways. The most important practical legacy was in banking and finance. The Templars had pioneered methods of moving money safely across long distances through letters of credit and encrypted documents. They had created an international network that allowed deposits in one location to be withdrawn in another. They had developed accounting systems to track complex transactions across multiple jurisdictions. They had established trust as the foundation of financial operations, building a reputation for reliability that made their services valuable. When the order was suppressed, these innovations didn't disappear. Other institutions and families, particularly Italian merchant bankers, had been watching what the Templars did and learning from it. The Medici family of Florence, which would dominate European banking in the 15th century, used systems remarkably similar to what the Templars had developed. Letters of credit, correspondent banking networks, careful record-keeping, reputation for honesty, all of these became standard practices in Renaissance banking. The Bardi and Peruzzi families, also Florentine, operated international banking networks in the 14th century that spanned Europe much as the Templar network had. They made loans to monarchs, managed deposits, transferred funds between cities. They learned from both Templar successes and Templar failures. They provided the same services but were more careful about political relationships, more cautious about becoming too powerful or too independent, more aware that creditors to kings needed royal goodwill more than kings needed creditors. The letter of credit itself became a standard instrument of medieval and Renaissance commerce. A merchant in Venice who needed to make payment in London would deposit money with a banker in Venice and receive a document that could be presented in London for payment. The physical money never moved, only information moved. This made trade safer, cheaper, more efficient. It was the same basic system the Templars had created for pilgrims, now applied more broadly to commercial transactions. The concept of banking as a network rather than as individual moneylenders was also a Templar contribution. Before the Templars, if you needed banking services, you dealt with an individual, a Jewish moneylender perhaps, or a merchant who also loaned money. The Templars showed that an organisation with multiple locations could provide services that no individual could match. This organisational approach to banking became standard. Renaissance banking houses were family firms, but they were firms, institutions with branches, staff, standardised procedures, coordination across distances. The legal frameworks the Templars had operated under also influenced later institutions. The idea that an organisation could own property while individuals within it owned nothing was refined in monastic orders but exemplified by the Templars. This separation of organisational and individual ownership would eventually influence how we think about corporations, entities that own assets and enter contracts separate from the individuals who comprise them. The Templars had also demonstrated how organisations could maintain discipline and coordination across vast distances through hierarchy, clear rules, regular communication, and institutional loyalty. These principles would be adapted by later organisations, both religious and secular. The Company of Jesus, the Jesuits, founded in the 16th century, consciously modelled some of their organisational structure on military orders like the Templars, combining religious discipline with coordinated action across the globe. But alongside these practical legacies, the Templars left something else, a legend that grew increasingly elaborate and divorced from historical reality over the centuries following their suppression. Let's explore how this mythology developed and what purposes it served. The Templars had been destroyed amid accusations of heresy and secret practices. Even though the charges were almost certainly false, the aura of secrecy remained. People knew the Templars had conducted private reception ceremonies and closed chapter meetings. They knew the order had accumulated wealth. They knew the suppression had been swift and brutal. And they wondered, what really happened? What secrets did the Templars hold? What treasures did they hide? These questions spawned legends. In the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, stories circulated about Templars who had escaped destruction, who continued in secret, who guarded ancient knowledge or sacred relics. Some stories claim the Templars had discovered important artifacts during their time on the Temple Mount, possibly the Ark of the Covenant, or secret Gospels, or ancient wisdom. These stories had no historical basis but satisfied a hunger for mystery and hidden truth. The treasure legends multiplied. If the Templars had been so wealthy, and if Philip's agents had not found enormous treasures when they raided Templar properties, then surely the treasure must have been hidden. Stories placed Templar gold in caves, in hidden vaults, buried on islands, taken to remote castles. Treasure hunters have searched for Templar wealth for centuries, finding nothing because there was likely nothing to find. The Templars' wealth was in land and revenues, not in hoards of gold coins and jewels. In the 17th and 18th centuries, as Freemasonry developed as a fraternal organisation, some Masonic traditions claimed connection to the Knights Templar. According to these traditions, Templar knowledge and initiatory practices had been preserved and passed down through secret channels, eventually influencing or founding Freemasonry. Masonic rites were developed that explicitly referenced Templar symbolism and history. The Scottish Rite and York Rite of Freemasonry both include degrees or orders that honour the Templars and claim spiritual descent from them. There is no credible historical evidence that Freemasons are actually descended from medieval Templars. Freemasonry as an organisation can be traced to the 17th and early 18th centuries, and its rituals and symbols draw from various sources including stonemasonry guilds, biblical tradition, and chivalric romance. The Templar connection is mythological rather than historical, but the myth served a purpose. It gave Freemasonry a romantic backstory, a claim to ancient wisdom, a connection to Knights and Crusades that appealed to the imagination. In the 19th century, Romantic authors and poets embraced the Templar story. Sir Walter Scott's novel Ivanhoe featured Templar characters, portraying them as proud, arrogant, but also impressive warriors. The Templars became figures in historical romance, mysterious knights with secret knowledge, tragic heroes destroyed by corruption and greed. This romantic image further embedded the Templars in popular consciousness, though the literary Templars bore limited resemblance to the actual medieval warrior monks. The 20th and 21st centuries have seen an explosion of Templar mythology and popular culture. Novels, films, television shows, and video games have featured the Templars as guardians of secrets, possessors of ancient artifacts, conspirators in secret wars, immortal warriors, and more. The order appears in works ranging from historical fiction, attempting accuracy, to wild fantasy, with no pretense of historical truth. The historical Templars have become a blank screen onto which people project their interests in conspiracy, hidden knowledge, alternative histories, and romantic adventure. Some modern organisations claim to be revivals or continuations of the Knights Templar. These range from Catholic organisations dedicated to pilgrimage and charity that use Templar imagery and name, to New Age groups claiming esoteric knowledge, to outright frauds seeking to exploit people's fascination with the legend. None of these have legitimate historical connection to the medieval order. When the Templars were suppressed in 1312, the organisation ended. No secret continuation existed. The claims of modern groups to be quote, _9_ are inventions. Sometimes sincere but historically baseless, sometimes cynical attempts to gain credibility or money. Why has the Templar legend persisted so powerfully? What is it about this particular medieval military order that captures imagination in ways that, say, the Hospitallers or Teutonic Knights do not? Part of the answer is in their end. The Templars were destroyed dramatically suddenly, through accusations that seemed to confirm that something secret and potentially sinister was happening behind closed doors. They didn't fade away or transform gradually. They were arrested, tried, and suppressed in less than a decade. This dramatic fall invites speculation and conspiracy thinking. If they were destroyed so thoroughly, there must have been something important to destroy. If the charges were false, as most historians believe, then what was the real reason? The gap between public accusations and hidden motives creates space for alternative narratives. Another part of the answer is in what the Templars actually were. Warrior monks who became bankers, an organisation that combined seemingly contradictory identities. This combination is inherently intriguing. Monks are supposed to be peaceful, contemplative, withdrawn from the world. Warriors are violent, active, engaged with worldly power. Bankers are calculating, concerned with profit, embedded in commerce. The Templars were all of these at once, and that complexity invites interpretation and reinterpretation. The Templars also existed at the intersection of multiple themes that resonate across cultures: Crusades and holy war, banking and wealth, secret knowledge and hidden power, loyalty and betrayal, rise and fall. Their story can be read as religious tale, as financial history, as conspiracy thriller, as cautionary fable. This versatility means different people find different meanings in the same events. But what do historians actually know, as opposed to what legend claims? Let's be clear about what the evidence supports and what it doesn't. We know the Templars were founded around 1119 as a small group dedicated to protecting pilgrims. We know they grew rapidly through donations and recruitment, becoming a large international organisation. We know they held extensive properties across Europe and the Crusader states. We know they developed banking services including letters of credit and deposit safekeeping. We know they fought in major battles and garrisoned important castles. We know they were suppressed in 1312 after arrests and trials that produced confessions extracted through torture. We know their property was transferred to the Hospitallers and that individual Templars faced various fates. We do not know of any secret doctrines or heretical practices beyond what was alleged in trials whose evidence was tainted by torture. We do not know of any hidden treasures beyond what was documented in property inventories. We do not know of any Templars discovering important artifacts on the Temple Mount. We do not know of any secret continuation of the order after 1312. These are legends, not history, and scholars who study the primary sources find no support for them. This doesn't mean the Templars were dull or unimportant. The actual history is fascinating enough without embellishment. An organisation of warrior monks who pioneered international banking, who managed resources across 3 continents, who served popes and kings while maintaining distinctive identity and discipline, who survived for 2 centuries before being destroyed through political manipulation of religious authority. This is a remarkable story that requires no addition of conspiracy theories or hidden treasures. The lessons of the Templar story remain relevant. The most obvious is about the relationship between creditors and sovereign debtors. The Templars lent money to kings and ended up destroyed by one of their debtors. This pattern would repeat throughout history. Creditors to sovereigns are always vulnerable because sovereigns have power that individual creditors lack. The only protection is political, and political protection depends on remaining useful and non-threatening. Later banking families learned this lesson. They diversified their debtors, never becoming too dependent on any single sovereign. They maintained political flexibility, shifting alliances when necessary. They avoided becoming too powerful or too independent. The Medici Bank, for instance, was closely tied to Florentine politics, but never claimed the kind of independence from secular authority that the Templars had enjoyed through papal protection. The Templar story also teaches about institutional mission and adaptation. The Templars were founded with a clear, specific mission: protect pilgrims in the Holy Land. When that mission became obsolete with the loss of the Holy Land, they struggled to redefine themselves. Their banking operations were successful and valuable, but they were seen as secondary to the military religious mission. The Templars couldn't or wouldn't fully embrace a new identity as a financial institution. This left them vulnerable. Organisations that survive long-term typically do so by adapting their missions to changing circumstances while maintaining core values and competencies. The Hospitallers adapted by shifting geographic focus from the Levant to Rhodes to Malta, maintaining their identity as military defenders of Christendom while changing where and how they fought. The Templars, by contrast, tried to maintain their original mission, even when circumstances made it impossible, and they paid the price for that rigidity. There's also a lesson about how success creates vulnerability. The Templars succeeded brilliantly at what they set out to do. They built a powerful, wealthy organisation, but that very success made them targets. Their wealth attracted Philip's greed. Their power made them threatening. Their privileges generated resentment. If they had remained 9 poor knights protecting pilgrims on dangerous roads, they would never have become important enough to destroy. Success elevated them, and elevation made them vulnerable to being cut down. Finally, there's a lesson about the fragility of trust and reputation. The Templars built their banking operations on trust. People trusted them to honour letters of credit, to safeguard deposits, to maintain accounts honestly. This trust took generations to build, was based on consistent performance and reputation for integrity. And it was destroyed in days through accusations that were probably false. Once the arrests happened, once the charges were made public, once confessions were extracted and publicized, trust evaporated. Whether the charges were true mattered less than whether they were believed. This fragility of reputation matters for any institution, but particularly for financial institutions. Banking depends on confidence. When confidence is lost, whether through actual misconduct or false accusations that are believed, the institution can collapse with remarkable speed. The Templars learned this in the harshest way possible. So the Knights Templar left us practical innovations in banking and finance that shaped medieval and Renaissance commerce, and ultimately contributed to modern financial systems. They left us organisational principles about hierarchy, coordination, and separation of individual and institutional ownership. They left us legal frameworks and precedents. These are real, tangible legacies that influenced how later institutions operated. They also left us a legend that has grown far beyond historical reality, a mythology of secret knowledge and hidden treasures and mysterious powers. This legend serves various purposes for different people: entertainment, spiritual seeking, business opportunities, fodder for conspiracy theories. It has little to do with the actual medieval warrior monks, but has become its own cultural phenomenon. And they left us cautionary tales about power and vulnerability, about the relationship between creditors and debtors, about institutional adaptation and mission, about how success can create the conditions for destruction. These lessons are not unique to the Templars, but their story illustrates them with particular clarity. The white-mantled knights who rode through the medieval world, praying in dawn darkness and fighting in desert heat, managing estates and counting coins in vault rooms, believing they served God while reshaping finance. These men are gone. The order they built no longer exists except in legend and memory. But what they created, the innovations they pioneered, the patterns their rise and fall illustrated, these remain woven into the fabric of our economic and institutional history. They were not the mystical guardians of ancient secrets that legend claims. They were something more interesting. Practical men who solved real problems, who built an organization of remarkable sophistication, who combined seemingly incompatible identities into something unprecedented, and who were destroyed when the world they had helped create no longer needed them. That true story, properly understood, teaches more than any legend could. And so we've travelled together through nearly 2 centuries, from 1119 to 1314, from 9 poor knights with a sacred idea to an international power brought down by greed and political calculation. We've watched warrior monks become bankers, seen vows of poverty coexist with organisational wealth, witnessed innovation and destruction, loyalty and betrayal, courage and suffering. The Templars created something remarkable: methods of moving money that changed medieval commerce, organisational structures that coordinated across continents, a fusion of faith and finance that seemed impossible. And they learned what institutions throughout history have learned: that success creates vulnerability, that power without protection is fragile, that the same forces that elevate can destroy. If you've enjoyed this slow drift through medieval vaults and desert castles, through prayers at dawn and battles at midday, through ledgers and letters of credit, please consider liking and subscribing. And to those already here, thank you for making this journey with me. Wherever you are right now, whatever time it is in your world, let yourself settle deeper into rest. The Templars are long gone, their white mantles faded into history. But the patterns they lived, rise and fall, innovation and adaptation, the eternal dance between power and vulnerability, these continue. Breathe slowly. Let your thoughts drift like dust motes in candlelight falling through a quiet chapel. The past is safely past. Sleep well and dream of distant times when monks counted gold, and warriors prayed and everything for a moment seemed possible. Good night,